as twilight drapes the world in its velvet embrace, and stars begin their ancient dance across the heavens. Welcome to Nightfall Royals. Tonight, we light a gentle candle for a woman whose life spanned nearly a century, whose reign touched every corner of the earth, and whose heart knew both profound joy and deep sorrow. Let us journey together through the remarkable life of Queen Victoria, as softly as moonlight touches a sleeping garden, as gently as time itself unfolds its precious memories. In the gentle morning light of May 24th, 1819, as the dew still clung to the roses in Kensington Palace Gardens, a baby's cry echoed through the quiet corridors. It was a sound that would shape an empire, though none could know it then. The infant was small, healthy, and bore the name Alexandrina, Victorian name that would one day be whispered with reverence across 7 continents. Picture, if you will, the peaceful red brick palace where she spent her earliest years, its windows catching the soft London sunlight like gentle eyes. Kensington Palace was not the grandest of royal residences, but it held a warmth, domestic tranquility that would forever shape young Victoria's understanding of what a home could be. The rooms where she played were filled with the amber glow of afternoon sun, where dust motes danced like tiny stars in the quiet air. Her father, the Duke of Kent, was a man of military bearing but surprising gentleness. In the evenings, when the palace grew quiet and the servants' footsteps echoed softly in distant halls, the key would often sit by Victoria's nursery window, watching the lights of London twinkle like earthbound constellations. He dreamed of the future his daughter might inherit. Though he could not have imagined the scope of the empire she would one day guide with such steady hands. Tragedy came early, as it so often does to those destined for greatness. When Victoria was barely 8 months old, her father fell ill with pneumonia during the harsh winter of 1820. The palace grew hushed in those final days of January, servants moving like shadows through corridors that seemed to hold their breath. On the 23rd of January, as snow fell silently on the palace gardens, the Duke of Kent passed away, leaving behind a baby daughter who would never remember his voice, but would carry his sense of duty like a sacred flame. The Duchess of Kent, Victoria's mother, found herself alone in a foreign land, speaking English with a soft German accent that would forever remind Victoria of lullabies and bedtime stories. The Duchess was a woman of remarkable strength, though she wrapped that strength in layers of maternal protection that sometimes felt as confining as they were loving. She created around her daughter a world within a world, the Kensington system. They called it where Victoria was educated, cherished, and carefully shielded from the rougher currents of court life. Young Victoria's days unfolded with the gentle rhythm of a well-tended garden. Her mornings began with lessons in languages German, flowing like music, French, elegant as silk, Italian, melodious as summer rain. Her governess, Baroness Lazan, was a woman of quiet wisdom, who understood that a future queen must be educated not just in facts and figures, but in the deeper mysteries of human nature. Together, they would walk through Kensington Gardens, where Victoria learned to identify birds by their songs and flowers by their scents, storing away memories that would bring her comfort in later years when the weight of the crown felt almost too heavy to to bear. The palace library became Victoria's sanctuary. Room where afternoon light slanted through tall windows and illuminated rows of leather-bound books that held all the wisdom of the world. Here she discovered the stories of queens who had ruled before her, Elizabeth I, who had faced down the Spanish Armada with courage burning in her heart. Mary I, whose tragic reign taught Victoria that power without compassion becomes tyranny. She read of distant lands and foreign peoples, of poetry and philosophy, of the natural sciences that were transforming the world beyond the palace walls. But it was in the quieter moments that Victoria's character truly formed. In the early evenings, when the palace settled into peaceful twilight, she would often sit with her half-sister Theodora, who was 12 years her senior. Theodora would brush Victoria's hair with long, gentle strokes while telling stories of their shared German relatives, castles perched on mountainsides where eagles soared and forests whispered ancient secrets. These intimate moments taught Victoria that royalty, at its heart, was simply another word for family, for the deep bonds that connect one generation to the next like golden threads in an endless tapestry. Music filled the palace like incense, gentle and ever-present. Victoria showed an early aptitude for the piano, her small fingers finding melodies that seemed to rise from somewhere deep within her soul. Her music master would arrive each Tuesday and Friday afternoon when the light in the music room turned golden amber. And for an hour, the palace would fill with the sound of scales and simple sonatas. Later, when Victoria had grown skilled enough to play more complex pieces, she would sometimes perform for her mother and Baroness Lausanne in the evenings, the music flowing through the quiet rooms like water over smooth stones. Drawing became another refuge, another way of seeing the world with quiet attention. Victoria would sit for hours at her small easel, carefully sketching the view from her bedroom window, the ancient oak trees that had stood sentinel over the palace for centuries, the flower beds that bloomed in careful succession through the seasons, the servants going about their daily tasks with the unconscious grace of people who understood their place in the world's larger pattern. Her sketches were careful, detailed, touched with a love for the small beauties that surrounded her daily life. As Victoria grew from toddler to child, the question of succession began to cast its shadow across the peaceful world of Kensington Palace. Her grandfather, King George III, had been succeeded by her uncle George IV, who ruled in a haze of extravagance and scandal that seemed to belong to a different world entirely from Victoria's quiet palace life. Next in line came her Uncle William, a naval man of bluff good humor who had spent his youth sailing the world's oceans and would bring to the throne a refreshing directness that England had not seen in decades. But behind these immediate successions lay a more complex truth. Victoria was third in line to the throne, and with each passing year, as no legitimate heirs appeared before her in the succession, that possibility grew more real. The Duchess of Kent began to speak more seriously of duty, of the great responsibility that might one day rest on Victoria's young shoulders. These conversations took place in the evening twilight, mother and daughter sitting together in the small drawing room where a fire crackled softly and the grate and shadows danced gently on the wall-papered walls. Victoria listened to these talks of her possible future with the grave attention of a child who has learned early that words have weight, that promises are sacred things. She understood, even at 8 or 9 years old, that her life might not be entirely her own, that she might one day belong, in some profound way, to all the people of England and beyond. The thought was both thrilling and sobering, like standing at the edge of a vast ocean and knowing that one day you might need to sail across it alone. The turning point came in 1830, when Victoria was 11 years old and the world beyond Kensington Palace began to press more insistently against her protected existence. Her Uncle George IV died in June of that year, and the crown passed to her Uncle William, who became King William IV. Suddenly, Victoria was no longer third in line to the throne. She was second, with only her elderly uncle standing between her and a destiny that seemed to grow larger and more inevitable with each passing day. That autumn, as the leaves in Kensington Gardens turned gold and scarlet and fell like gentle benedictions on the palace paths, Victoria began to understand that her childhood was drawing to a close. The lessons grew more serious, the conversations about duty more frequent. Yet there was no panic in this realization, no desperate clinging to a disappearing past. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, a growing understanding that great responsibilities often come disguised as gifts, and that the girl who had learned to find peace in library corners and music room afternoons was already becoming the woman who would one day guide an empire with wisdom and grace. The palace itself seemed to sense the approaching change. The very walls, which had sheltered Victoria's first 11 years with such gentle constancy, now seemed to whisper of larger rooms and grander responsibilities waiting beyond their familiar embrace. But the lessons learned within those walls of duty, balanced with compassion, of strength, tempered with humility, of the deep peace that comes from understanding one's place in the world's great pattern. These would remain with Victoria always, like a compass pointing toward true north, even in the stormiest seas. The morning of June 20th, 1837, dawned with unusual quietness over London, as if the very air knew that change was coming. In the early hours, while most of the great city still slept beneath blankets of summer mist, a small group of solemn officials made their way through the gates of Kensington Palace. Their footsteps echoed softly on the cobblestones, carrying news that would transform an 18-year-old girl into the sovereign of the most powerful empire on earth. Victoria had been awakened from deep sleep, still wearing her simple white nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders like a young woman rather than a queen. When the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain entered her presence, she understood immediately, without words, what their grave faces meant. Her Uncle William IV had died during the night at Windsor Castle, and the crown, heavy with centuries of tradition, bright with the expectations of millions, had passed to her with the inevitability of sunrise. Picture that moment, if you will. A girl who had never expected to rule, standing barefoot on the carpet of her childhood home, while men old enough to be her grandfather knelt before her and addressed her as Your Majesty. For the first time, there was no fanfare, no trumpet calls echoing through marble halls. Only the soft morning light filtering through familiar windows, and the weight of destiny settling on shoulders that seemed too slight to bear it. Victoria's first act as queen was characteristically thoughtful. She asked for an hour alone to dress and compose herself, to say goodbye in her heart to the girl she had been just moments before. In that hour, she stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the gardens where she had played as a child. Watching the familiar oak trees sway gently in the morning breeze. The world beyond looked exactly the same as it had the day before, yet everything had changed irrevocably. When she emerged to meet her first Privy Council at 11 o'clock that morning, Victoria had transformed herself. Gone was the barefoot girl in her nightgown. In her place stood a young woman dressed in deep mourning for her uncle, her hair arranged with simple dignity, her spine straight with newfound resolve. The counselors, who had expected to find a nervous child overwhelmed by circumstance, instead encountered a sovereign who spoke with quiet authority about her dedication to the Constitution and her deep love for her people. The months that followed were like learning to walk on shifting ground. Every day brought new challenges that no amount of education could have fully prepared her for. There were audiences with ministers who had served her grandfather and great-uncles, men who remembered when she was simply Princess Victoria, a distant possibility rather than a present reality. There were state papers to review, each one carrying consequences that rippled far beyond the palace walls. There were ceremonies to learn, traditions to uphold, a whole elaborate dance of monarchy that she must master while the eyes of the world watched her every step. Windsor Castle became her primary residence, and Victoria found herself walking through rooms where kings had lived and died for nearly 1,000 years. The castle's ancient stones seemed to whisper the stories of all who had worn the crown before her, from medieval warrior kings to her immediate predecessors. At night, when the castle settled into peaceful quiet and the last courtiers had withdrawn, Victoria would sometimes walk the corridors alone, her soft footsteps echoing in the vast spaces, feeling the weight of all that history pressing gently against her consciousness. Yet it was not the grand rooms or ceremonial duties that proved most challenging for the young queen. It was the loneliness, the particular isolation that comes from being the one person in the kingdom who can never truly share her burdens, never fully relax into the comfort of being simply human. At 18, when most young women were dancing at balls and dreaming of romance, Victoria found herself signing death warrants and navigating the treacherous waters of international diplomacy. Her relationship with her mother, the Duchess of Kent, became strained during these early months of her reign. The protective cocoon that had sheltered Victoria's childhood now felt confining, inappropriate for a reigning monarch. The Duchess and her advisor, Sir John Conroy, had expected to continue their influence over Victoria's decisions, but the young queen quickly made it clear that she intended to rule in her own right. The conversations between mother and daughter, once warm with shared affection, now carried the cool formality of diplomatic negotiations. It was Lord Melbourne, her first prime minister, who became Victoria's guide through these treacherous early waters. Melbourne was a man of the world, sophisticated and worldly wise, yet he possessed a fatherly gentleness that provided exactly the support Victoria needed. In the evenings, After the formal business of government had concluded, he would often remain at the palace to dine with the queen. Their conversations, ranging from matters of state to literature, philosophy, and 1,000 small observations that make up a life lived with attention and care. Under Melbourne's patient tutelage, Victoria began to understand the subtle art of constitutional monarchy. She learned that true power lay not in commanding obedience, but in earning respect. Not in imposing her will, but in serving as a living symbol of the nation's highest aspirations. She discovered that the crown was not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a responsibility to be carried with grace, wisdom, and unfailing dedication to the welfare of her people. The state opening of Parliament in November 1837 marked Victoria's first major public ceremony as Queen. As she rode through the streets of London in the Golden State coach, surrounded by the pageantry that had accumulated around the monarchy over centuries, she saw for the first time the faces of the people she had sworn to serve. They lined the streets in their thousands, working men in their Sunday best, women holding children up to catch a glimpse of their young queen, elderly people who remembered her grandfather's reign and marveled at the wheel of time that had brought them this moment. Their cheers filled the autumn air like music, but it was their faces that stayed with Victoria long after the ceremony had ended. She saw hope there and pride, but also worried the concerns of ordinary people living through a time of great change and uncertainty. The Industrial Revolution was transforming England from a rural nation into the workshop of the world, bringing prosperity to some but upheaval to many. Victoria understood that her reign would need to navigate these changes with wisdom and compassion, helping her people find their way through a world that was being remade around them. Christmas of 1837 was Victoria's first as queen, and she chose to spend it quietly at Windsor Castle with a small gathering of family and close advisors. The great hall was decorated with holly and ivy, candles flickered in every window, and a warm fire burned in the enormous hearth. As Victoria sat at the head of the table during Christmas dinner, wearing a simple dress of deep green silk rather than the elaborate court dress that protocol might have demanded, she reflected on the year that had transformed her life so completely. The loneliness was still there, would never entirely disappear, but it was balanced now by a growing sense of purpose. Victoria was beginning to understand that the crown she wore was not meant to elevate her above her people, but to bind her to them in service. Every decision she made, every word she spoke in her official capacity, every gesture she made in public was part of a larger conversation between the monarchy and the nation, a dialogue that had been continuing for centuries and would continue long after she was gone. As the year drew to a close, Victoria established what would become a lifelong practice, keeping a detailed journal of her thoughts, experiences, and reflections. Writing by candlelight in her private study after the day's official duties were complete, she recorded not just the events of her reign, but her inner responses to them. Kay's private pages became her confidant. The place where the queen could set aside her public mask and examine her own heart with honest scrutiny. In those journal entries, we glimpse the real Victoriana, the remote sovereign of popular imagination, not a young woman grappling with immense responsibility while trying to remain true to her own deepest values. She wrote of her determination to be worthy of the trust her people had placed in her, of her growing understanding of the complex forces shaping the modern world, and of her quiet faith that good intentions, guided by wisdom, could make a real difference in the lives of ordinary people. The first year of Victoria's reign ended as it had begun, quietly, without fanfare, marked more by inner transformation than external pageantry. As she blew out the candles in her study on New Year's Eve and made her way to bed through the silent corridors of Windsor Castle, Victoria was no longer the uncertain girl who had been awakened at Kensington Palace on that June morning. She had become, in the truest sense, a queen, not because of the crown on her head, but because of the dedication in her heart and the growing wisdom in her decisions. In the amber light of autumn 1839, as golden leaves drifted past the windows of Windsor Castle like nature's own confetti, love came to Queen Victoria in the most unexpected way, not as a political arrangement or diplomatic necessity, but as a recognition of kinship between two souls who had been shaped by similar circumstances and shared dreams. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha arrived at Windsor on a gray October afternoon, the carriage wheels crunching softly on the gravel drive as he approached the castle, where Victoria waited with a mixture of curiosity and carefully controlled expectation. She had met him briefly 3 years earlier, when they were both still children navigating the complex world of European royal connections. But this visit carried different weight. Victoria was now a queen in need of a consort, and Albert, tall, thoughtful, with serious blue eyes that seemed to hold depths of unspoken understanding, had come to be evaluated as a potential husband. Yet, when they met again in the castle's blue drawing room, with the afternoon light streaming through tall windows and dust motes dancing in the air like tiny stars, politics and protocol melted away. Victoria saw not a diplomatic solution to the question of royal marriage, but a young man whose intelligence sparkled in his conversations, whose gentle manner spoke of strength held in careful restraint, and whose obvious dedication to worthy causes resonated with her own growing sense of purpose. Albert, for his part, discovered in Victoria not the imperious monarch he might have expected, but a young woman of surprising warmth and genuine curiosity about the world. When she laughed at his observations about English weather, when she asked thoughtful questions about his interests in science and music, when she showed him her sketches and watercolors with the shy pride of someone sharing a treasured private world, he began to see past the crown to the person who wore it. Their courtship unfolded in the quiet spaces between official duties walks through Windsor's gardens as autumn deepened into winter, as evenings in the music room where Albert would play piano while Victoria sang, long conversations by the fire in the castle's private apartments, where they discovered the remarkable compatibility of their minds and hearts. There was nothing rushed or dramatic about their falling in love. It happened gradually, naturally, like flowers opening to sunlight or streams finding their way to the sea. Victoria found herself looking forward to Albert's presence with an anticipation that had nothing to do with royal protocol and everything to do with the simple human pleasure of being with someone who understood her completely. When he spoke of his dreams for improving education, bringing the benefits of science and industry to all people regardless of their station in life, she heard echoes of her own deepest convictions when he played Beethoven sonatas on winter evenings, his fingers drawing music from the keys like prayers made audible. She felt her heart respond with harmonies she hadn't known it contained. On October 15th, 1839, just 5 days after Albert's arrival at Windsor, Victoria made her decision. The scene was simple, almost mundane in its domestic tranquility. They were alone in the blue drawing room, the same space where they had renewed their acquaintance, with a fire crackling softly in the grate and the last autumn roses visible through the windows. Victoria, who, as a reigning queen, could not receive a proposal, but must make one herself, found the words flowing naturally from her heart. "It would make me too happy if you would consent to what I wish," she told him, her voice steady despite the raising of her heart. Albert's response was immediate and heartfelt. He took her hands in his and spoke of his own deep feelings, of his joy at the prospect of sharing his life with someone he could truly love and admire. The moment was witnessed only by the flickering firelight and the patient furniture that had observed countless royal conversations over the centuries. Their engagement was announced to a world that watched royal romances with the intensity of people starved for genuine fairy tales. Yet Victoria and Albert remained remarkably grounded throughout the months of preparation that followed. They wrote letters to each other during brief separations, tender missives that revealed the depth of their emotional connection and their shared vision of what their marriage might accomplish. Albert's letters, in particular, showed his understanding that he was not simply marrying a woman he loved, but accepting a role in history that would require him to find ways to serve England while supporting Victoria's reign. The wedding preparations themselves became a reflection of Victoria's character. She insisted on a ceremony that would be magnificent enough to honor the monarchy, yet personal enough to celebrate a genuine love match. The wedding dress was of white silk satin, simple in design, but exquisite in execution, setting a fashion that would influence wedding gowns for generations to come. The ceremony would take place at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, a space intimate enough to feel like a true wedding rather than merely a state occasion. On the morning of February 10th, 1840, Victoria woke at Windsor Castle to find snow falling gently outside her windows, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and new. As she prepared for the journey to London and her wedding, she wrote in her journal with the careful attention to detail that characterized all her private reflections. She recorded the weather, the flowers that would decorate the chapel, the music that would celebrate their union, but also her own inner state, nervous but joyful, aware of the historical significance of the day, but focused most intently on the personal transformation it would bring. The ceremony itself was everything Victoria had hoped it would, the solemn yet joyful, grand yet intimate, filled with the music and poetry that both she and Albert loved. when they exchanged vows, speaking the ancient words that had bound countless couples before them. The chapel seemed to hold its breath in recognition of something rare and precious, a royal marriage founded on genuine love and mutual respect. But it was the moments after the ceremony that perhaps meant the most to Victoria. The quiet carriage ride back to Windsor with her new husband, the wedding breakfast with close family where she could finally relax and enjoy Albert's presence without the weight of public observation. The first evening they spent as husband and wife in the private apartments that would now be their shared home. Their honeymoon was spent at Windsor Castle, deliberately private and domestic in nature. Victoria and Albert walked the grounds together, Albert pointing out improvements he might make to the gardens, Victoria showing him her favorite reading spots and quiet corners where she had learned to find peace during the challenging early years of her reign. They read together in the evenings, Albert's voice bringing new life to familiar poems and passages. They played music together, Albert's accomplished piano skills complementing Victoria's warm, expressive singing voice. Most importantly, they began the delicate work of learning to be partners in both marriage and governance. Albert had come to England with serious intentions about his role as prince consort. He wanted to be more than merely decorative, more than simply the Queen's husband. He had ideas about education, about science, about social reform that could help England navigate the challenges of rapid industrial and social change. Victoria, for her part, was eager to share the intellectual burdens of her position with someone whose judgment she trusted completely. Their early married life established patterns that would sustain them through decades of shared responsibility. Morning rides through Windsor Great Park, where they could discuss matters of state away from the listening ears of courtiers. Evenings spent reviewing official papers together, Albert's careful analysis helping Victoria see complex issues from new angles. Quiet dinners where they could set aside their official roles and simply enjoy each other's company as husband and wife. The depths of their partnership became evident in small details that outsiders rarely saw. The way Albert would quietly support Victoria during difficult audiences, his presence giving her confidence to speak her mind clearly. The way Victoria would defer to Albert's expertise in areas where his education had been more thorough than hers, trusting his judgment completely while maintaining her ultimate authority as sovereign. The way they developed their own private language of glances and gestures that allowed them to communicate even in crowded state occasions. Within months of their marriage, it became clear that Victoria and Albert had achieved something rare in royal unions, a genuine meeting of minds and hearts that strengthened both partners. Albert began to take on increasing responsibilities, his intelligence and dedication earning the respect of ministers and courtiers who had initially been skeptical of his influence. Victoria, supported by a partner who truly understood the challenges she faced, grew in confidence and authority, her decisions carrying the weight of careful consultation with someone whose judgment she trusted absolutely. Their love story was not the stuff of romantic novels. There were no dramatic rescues or grand gestures. Instead, it was built on the quieter foundations of mutual respect, shared values, and the daily choice to support and cherish each other through whatever challenges their unique position might bring. It was a love that grew stronger with time, that found expression not just in private moments of tenderness, but in their joint dedication to serving England with wisdom and compassion. The early years of Victoria and Albert's marriage transformed Windsor Castle from a place of official residence into something warmer and more precious, a true family home where love flourished in the quiet spaces between state duties. Spring turned to summer in 1840. The castle's ancient stones seemed to absorb the happiness of its royal inhabitants. And even the most formal corridors took on an atmosphere of domestic contentment. Albert threw himself into the work of becoming not just Victoria's husband, but England's devoted servant. He rose early each morning, often before dawn, to study the correspondence and reports that flowed endlessly into the palace. By the time Victoria joined him for breakfast, it already prepared thoughtful summaries of the most important matters requiring her attention. Its neat handwriting filling the margins with observations and suggestions that invariably proved both wise and practical. Their breakfast conversations became a daily parliament of two, where the business of governing was discussed with the intimate ease of a married couple planning their day. Victoria would sit at the sunny end of their private dining room, still in her morning dress, while Albert reviewed the appointments and audiences scheduled for the coming hours. Between bites of toast and sips of tea, they would explore the nuances of foreign policy, the challenges of domestic reform, the delicate balance required to maintain the monarchy's relevance in a rapidly changing world. Albert's influence on Victoria's reign was immediate and profound, though always exercised with the utmost tact and respect for her constitutional position. He never sought to supplant her authority, but rather to amplify it through careful research and thoughtful analysis. When difficult decisions arose, he would present her with meticulously prepared briefings that laid out all sides of complex issues, allowing Victoria to make choices from a position of thorough understanding rather than partial knowledge. The castle's private apartments began to reflect their shared interests and values. Albert, who had been raised with a deep appreciation for the arts and sciences, gradually filled their living spaces with beautiful objects that served educational as well as aesthetic purposes. Botanical specimens brought back from expeditions to distant corners of the empire found places alongside Renaissance paintings and carefully chosen pieces of sculpture. The effect was not of ostentatious display, but of thoughtful curation, a home that reflected serious minds engaged with the beauty and complexity of the world. Victoria found herself intellectually stimulated in ways she had never experienced during her carefully protected childhood. Albert introduced her to new areas of knowledge, sharing his fascination with scientific discoveries and technological innovations that were transforming human possibilities. In the evenings, after the day's official duties were complete, they would often retreat to their private study, where Albert would read aloud from the latest works of natural philosophy, or share correspondence from the leading thinkers of their time. Music which had always been important to Victoria, became a shared language of the heart in their marriage. Albert's skill at the piano was exceptional. Kay, and his deep knowledge of musical literature opened new worlds of appreciation for Victoria. They would spend long winter evenings in the castle's music room. Albert playing complex Bach fugues or Beethoven sonatas, while Victoria listened with growing understanding of music's mathematical beauty and emotional power. Sometimes she would sing, her voice weaving melody around Albert's accompaniment in impromptu concerts that no audience beyond the castle walls would ever hear. Their shared love of the outdoors led to long walks through Windsor's expanses, conversations continuing as they moved through landscapes that changed with the seasons like a vast, living calendar. In spring, they would walk among the bluebells that carpeted the forest floors, Albert pointing out the intricate relationships between plants and soil, weather and wildlife that made each ecosystem a marvel of natural organization. Summer brought them to the castle's gardens, where Albert began to implement his ideas about landscape design and horticultural improvement. Albert's greatest gift to Victoria may have been his ability to help her see her role as queen, not as a burden to be endured, but as an opportunity to serve purposes larger than themselves. He spoke eloquently of the monarchy's potential to be a force for moral leadership, of the Queen's unique position to encourage education, support the arts, and advocate for the welfare of her people. Under his influence, Victoria began to understand that true royalty lay not in privilege, but in service, not in commanding obedience, but in earning trust through consistent dedication to the common good. Their first child, Victoria Adelaide Mary Louisa, was born on November 21st, 1840, 9 months after their wedding. The birth took place at Buckingham Palace, with Albert holding Victoria's hand through the long hours of labor, his presence providing comfort and strength when pain might have overwhelmed her resolve. When the baby's first cry echoed through the royal apartments, Victoria and Albert looked at each other with a wonder common to all new parents, yet touched with the additional responsibility of knowing their child would be born into extraordinary circumstances. Little Princess Victoria, who would be called Vicky within the family, became the center of a domestic happiness that transformed the palace's atmosphere completely. Victoria and Albert were determined to be hands-on parents, refusing to delegate their children's care entirely to nurses and governesses, as royal tradition might have dictated. They personally supervised feeding schedules, took turns comforting the baby during restless nights, and spent hours simply watching their daughter with the fascination of people discovering unexpected depths in their own capacity for love. Albert proved to be a remarkably devoted father, bringing to parenthood the same careful attention and thoughtful preparation he applied to all his responsibilities. He read extensively about child development and education, corresponding with leading experts at the time about the best methods for nurturing young minds. He designed toys that would stimulate learning as well as provide entertainment, and he planned educational experiences that would help their children understand their privileged position as an opportunity for service rather than an excuse for self-indulgence. Victoria discovered that motherhood opened new chambers in her heart that she hadn't known existed. The fierce protectiveness she felt for her daughter surprised her with its intensity, and the simple pleasure she took in baby Vicky's smiles and sounds reminded her that beneath the crown and official responsibilities, she remained fundamentally human. The baby's presence also deepened her appreciation for Albert's character. Watching him gently rock their daughter to sleep or sing lullabies in his melodious, German-accented English, she saw new facets of the man she had married. The arrival of their second child, Albert Edward, later to become King Edward VII in November 1841, confirmed the pattern of devoted family life that Victoria and Albert had established. Bertie, as he was known within the family, was a more challenging baby than his sister had been, more prone to fussing and difficult to soothe. But Albert's patience with his son seemed unlimited, and Victoria watched with growing admiration as her husband found ways to calm the restless infant through soft singing, gentle rocking, or simply the steady reassurance of his presence. As their family grew, so did Victoria and Albert's understanding of their unique position in British society. They began to see themselves not just as the monarch and her consort, but as an example of domestic happiness that could inspire their subjects toward their own ideals of family life. Their marriage represented something new in royal history, union based on genuine love and mutual respect. It's conducted with dignity and moral purpose that stood in sharp contrast to the scandals and excesses that had marked previous royal generations. The palace staff, initially skeptical of Albert's foreign ways and uncertain about his role in the household hierarchy, gradually came to respect and even love the prince consort. His unfailing courtesy toward servants, his genuine interest in their welfare, and his obvious devotion to the queen earned him loyalty that went far beyond mere duty. The castle's atmosphere reflected this harmony, becoming a place where work was performed with pride and dedication rather than mere obligation. Victoria's reign during these early years of marriage was marked by a new confidence and authority that clearly reflected Albert's supportive influence. Her speeches to Parliament carried greater depth and nuance. Her audiences with ministers became more substantive discussions rather than mere formalities, and her correspondence with other European monarchs demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of international affairs that impressed seasoned diplomats. The palace became a center of intellectual and cultural life during these golden years of the early 1840s. Victoria and Albert regularly hosted salons where the leading thinkers, artists, and scientists of the day would gather for evenings of stimulating conversation. These gatherings were informal by royal standards, yet elevated by the quality of minds that came together under the castle's ancient roof. Charles Darwin might discuss his theories of natural selection, while a renowned pianist provided musical interludes, or a celebrated poet would read new work while distinguished historians debated the lessons of the past. Albert's vision extended beyond the palace walls to encompass the broader transformation of British society. He became deeply involved in educational reform, supporting the establishment of schools that will provide practical as well as classical learning for children of all social classes. Speeches on the importance of technical education, delivered with passionate conviction at public gatherings, helped shift British thinking toward a more inclusive and progressive approach to human development. The Prince Consort also threw himself into the promotion of arts and sciences, understanding that a truly great nation must excel not only in commerce and industry, but in the pursuits that ennoble the human spirit. He became patron of numerous learned societies, attended scientific lectures with the enthusiasm of a dedicated student, and encouraged Victoria to use her position to support research and discovery that might benefit all humanity. Their shared commitment to moral leadership found expression in countless small gestures that, taken together, helped redefine what it meant to be royal in the modern world. Established a pattern of charitable giving that was both generous and thoughtful, supporting causes that addressed root problems rather than merely alleviating symptoms. They opened parts of the royal art collection to public viewing, understanding that great works of art belonged, in some sense, to all people rather than merely to those who happened to possess them. As evening fell over Windsor Castle during these blessed years, Victoria and Albert would often walk together through the castle's corridors, their footsteps echoing softly in spaces that had witnessed centuries of royal life. Sometimes they would pause before portraits of Victoria's predecessors, discussing the lessons of history and the ways in which each generation of monarchs had adapted to the challenges of their times. These quiet conversations helped Victoria understand her reign not as an isolated chapter, but as part of a larger story that stretched back through centuries and would continue long after she was gone. Their love during these early years had the quality of a well-tended garden, carefully cultivated, constantly growing, beautiful in all seasons. It found expression not in grand romantic gestures, but in the daily courtesies they showed each other. In Albert's habit of bringing Victoria flowers from the castle gardens, in Victoria's attention to the small preferences and comforts that made Albert feel truly at home in his adopted country. The soft patter of small feet echoing through Windsor Castle's corridors became the sweetest music Victoria had ever heard. As the 1840s unfolded like pages in a cherished book, the royal apartments filled with the sounds and sights of growing children scattered across Persian carpets, cute picture books stacked on elegant tables, small voices calling for Mama and Papa in the mixture of English and German that became the family's intimate language. By 1848, Victoria and Albert had been blessed with 5 children, each arrival deepening their understanding of love's infinite capacity to expand and grow. To Vicky and Bertie came Alice in 1843, a thoughtful child with serious gray eyes who seemed to absorb the world's complexities with quiet wisdom. Then Alfred in 1844, nicknamed Affy, whose boisterous energy kept his parents on their toes and filled the palace with laughter. Helena followed in 1846, called Legend, a sturdy, practical child who would grow up to be her mother's right hand in countless charitable endeavors. Victoria discovered that motherhood suited her far better than she had dared hope during her own lonely childhood. Each pregnancy brought its own challenges and discomforts, but also a profound sense of fulfillment that surprised her with its intensity. She found herself marveling at the miracle of creation, at the way each child emerged as a complete individual with their own temperament, preferences, and mysterious inner life that gradually revealed itself through smiles, tears, and the thousand small gestures that make up a developing personality. Albert proved to be an extraordinary father, bringing to parenthood the same thoughtful preparation and dedicated attention he applied to all his responsibilities. He designed educational programs for each child that balanced intellectual development with physical activity and moral instruction. The palace schoolrooms became laboratories of learning where geography was taught through exploration of the castle grounds, natural history through observation of the changing seasons, and mathematics through practical applications that made abstract concepts concrete and memorable. The prince consort believed deeply that royal children should understand their privileged position as an opportunity for service rather than self-indulgence. He arranged for his children to meet people from all walks of life, farmers and craftsmen, scholars and artists, sailors and soldiers, helping them develop the broad sympathy and understanding that would serve them well in their future roles. These encounters, carefully planned yet natural in execution, became some of the children's most treasured memories. Victoria found particular joy in the intimate moments of family life that took place away from public view. Bath time became a ritual of splashing and laughter, with Victoria sometimes rolling up her sleeves to help wash small faces and untangle wet hair, while Albert stood by with warm towels and gentle teasing. Bedtime stories were shared responsibilities. Victoria's animated readings alternating with Albert's more scholarly approach to classic tales and moral fables. The family's daily routine centered around the children's needs while still accommodating the requirements of royal duty. Breakfast was served in the sunny morning room, where official dispatches waited alongside porridge bowls and where serious discussions of state might be interrupted by a toddler's request for help with a difficult button. Lunch often took the form of family picnics in the castle grounds, weather permitting, with lessons continuing outdoors through games and exploration. Evenings brought the family together in their private drawing room, where a fire crackled in winter and fresh flowers filled every vase in summer. Albert would play piano while the children gathered around, their young voices joining in simple songs that ranged from German folk melodies to English hymns. Victoria, her needlework in her lap, would watch these scenes with a contentment that seemed to fill her heart to overflowing. The children's individual personalities emerged early and distinctly. Vicky, the eldest, showed remarkable intellectual gifts and a maturity that sometimes worried Victoria, who wanted her daughter to enjoy childhood rather than rushing toward adult responsibilities. Vicky's quick mind and serious nature made her Albert's particular favorite, and father and daughter would spend hours in deep conversation about topics that seemed far too advanced for such a young person. Bertie, the heir to the throne, proved more challenging for his earnest parents. Unlike his studious sister, he showed little interest in academic pursuits, preferring physical activities and social interaction to books and lessons. Albert, determined that the future king should be thoroughly prepared for his responsibilities, designed increasingly rigorous educational programs that sometimes seemed to overwhelm the boy's more easygoing nature. Victoria watched these struggles with growing concern, torn between supporting her husband's high standards and protecting her son's individual spirit. Alice developed into a deeply empathetic child who seemed to absorb the emotions of everyone around her. She would comfort crying siblings with intuitive wisdom, and her drawings often depicted scenes of people helping each other through various difficulties. Victoria recognized in Alice something of her own capacity for deep feeling, and she made sure her sensitive daughter had plenty of quiet time to process the intense emotions that seemed to flow through her like water through a sponge. Affy brought energy and mischief to every situation, his curiosity leading him into adventures that kept his parents and nurses constantly alert. He showed an early fascination with ships and the sea, spending hours with toy boats in the castles, fountains, and peppering visiting naval officers with questions about distant ports and ocean voyages. His enthusiasm was infectious, bringing laughter to even the most serious family gatherings. Little Lynchen, though still a toddler, already showed signs of a practical intelligence that would later make her indispensable to Victoria's charitable work. She was the child who would notice when someone looked sad and offered her favorite toy as comfort, or who would try to help with household tasks despite her small size and limited coordination. The family's summers were spent at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, Albert's creation that became their private paradise away from the formal requirements of court life. Here, surrounded by gardens, Albert had designed and rooms decorated to their personal taste rather than historical precedent. Victoria and Albert could focus entirely on their roles as parents and partners without the constant interruptions of official duty. Osborne's gardens became an extension of the children's education, with Albert teaching them to identify plants and insects, to understand the principles of horticulture, and to appreciate the complex relationships that made each ecosystem a marvel of natural organization. The children learned to swim in the sea, to sail small boats in the protected waters near the shore, and to find their way through woods and meadows that became as familiar to them as the palace corridors. Victoria's journal entries from these years reveal a woman discovering depths of happiness she had never imagined possible. She wrote of the profound satisfaction of nursing her babies, of the pride she felt watching her older children master new skills, of the way Albert's patient guidance helped each child develop their individual gifts while maintaining their essential connection to the family unit. The challenges of royal parenthood were different from those faced by ordinary families, but no less real. Every decision about the children's education, every public appearance they made, every friendship they formed was scrutinized by courtiers, ministers, and the press. Victoria and Albert struggled to provide their children with as normal a childhood as possible, while preparing them for lives that would inevitably be lived in the public eye. Religious education formed an important part of the children's development, but Albert's approach emphasized the ethical and moral dimensions of faith rather than dogmatic adherence to particular doctrines. The family attended church services regularly, but their private devotions focused on developing compassion, integrity, and a sense of responsibility toward others less fortunate than themselves. As the children grew, Victoria began to understand that her greatest legacy might not be the political achievements of her reign, but the example she and Albert set as parents who balanced duty with love, authority with tenderness, and high expectations with unconditional acceptance. Their family life became a model that influenced not only their own subjects, but royal families throughout Europe and beyond. The portrait of family happiness that Victoria and Albert presented to the world was genuine rather than calculated for public consumption. Their love for each other and their children created an atmosphere of warmth and security that visitors to the palace could sense immediately. Foreign dignitaries, accustomed to the cold formality of many European courts, often commented on the natural ease and obvious affection that characterized the British royal family's interactions. Victoria's growth as a mother paralleled her development as a queen, each role informing and strengthening the other. The patience she learned from dealing with small children served her well in managing difficult ministers and diplomats. The protective instincts awakened by motherhood extended to encompass all her subjects, making her more sensitive to policies that affected families and children throughout the realm. In the crystalline dawn of May 1st, 1851, as the first rays of sunlight touched the revolutionary structure rising from Hyde Park, like a dream made manifest in iron and glass, London awakened to witness something unprecedented in human history. The great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations was about to open its doors, and with it, Prince Albert's grandest vision would be revealed to a wondering world. The idea had been germinating in Albert's mind for years, nurtured through countless conversations with Victoria, as they walked the grounds of Windsor or sat together in their private study after the children were asleep. He had observed the rapid changes transforming Britain and the world, the steam engines that were shrinking distances, the new manufacturing techniques that could produce goods in quantities previously unimaginable, the scientific discoveries that promised to reshape human understanding of everything from medicine to agriculture. What if, Albert wondered aloud to Victoria during one of their evening conversations, all these marvels could be gathered in one place? What if the greatest achievements of human ingenuity from every corner of the earth could be displayed together, not as trophies of conquest, but as testimonies to the creative power that resided in all peoples? What if such an exhibition could demonstrate that competition need not mean conflict, that nations could strive to excel while remaining at peace? Victoria had listened to these dreams with growing excitement, her imagination caught by the scope of Albert's vision. She understood immediately that this would be more than a mere display of commercial goods. It would be a declaration of faith in human potential. It's a celebration of the peaceful cooperation that might be possible if nations chose wisdom over warfare, creativity over destruction. The challenges of bringing such a vision to reality seemed almost insurmountable. Where could such an enormous exhibition be housed? How could exhibits from dozens of countries be transported safely to London? How could visitors from around the world be accommodated? Most daunting of all, how could the enormous costs be covered without burdening the treasury or compromising the exhibition's international character? Albert threw himself into solving these problems with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all his undertakings. He formed committees, consulted experts, studied similar exhibitions that had been attempted on smaller scales in other countries. He spent hours poring over architectural drawings and engineering specifications, learning enough about construction techniques to participate meaningfully in discussions about the exhibition building that would need to house this unprecedented gathering. The solution came from an unexpected source: Joseph Paxton, a gardener and architect who had designed innovative greenhouse structures for the Duke of Devonshire. Paxton's proposal was breathtaking in its audacity, a building constructed almost entirely of iron and glass, large enough to enclose mature elm trees and tall enough to accommodate the largest industrial machinery, yet light and airy enough to feel more like a garden pavilion than a conventional building. When Albert first saw Paxton's plans spread across a table in the palace library while afternoon light streamed through the windows, he knew immediately that this crystalline palace would be the perfect embodiment of the exhibition's spirit. The building itself would demonstrate the possibilities of modern technology while maintaining a beauty and transparency that seemed to invite the whole world inside. Victoria, initially concerned about the enormous risks involved in supporting such an ambitious project, found her doubts dissolving as Albert shared his enthusiasm for Paxton's vision. She began to see the Crystal Palace, as it was soon dubbed by the press, as a symbol of everything she and Albert hoped their reign might accomplish: progress guided by wisdom, innovation balanced with beauty, British leadership expressed through service rather than domination. The months of preparation that followed tested Albert's diplomatic skills as thoroughly as his organizational abilities. Convincing foreign governments to participate required delicate negotiations that balanced commercial interests with national pride. Letters flowed from Albert's desk to royal courts and industrial centers around the world, each one carefully crafted to convey both the practical benefits and the larger significance of participation in this unprecedented gathering. Victoria supported these efforts with her own correspondence, writing personal letters to fellow monarchs and their ministers, using her position to open doors that might have remained closed to a private promoter. Her growing reputation for integrity and sincere commitment to peaceful cooperation gave weight to these invitations, helping to overcome the natural suspicions that might have greeted such an ambitious international project. As construction of the Crystal Palace proceeded through the winter of 1852-51, it became a source of fascination for for Londoners who had never seen anything remotely like Paxton's revolutionary structure. Victoria and Albert made regular visits to Hyde Park, watching with wonder as the iron framework rose and the glass walls began to enclose vast spaces that seemed to capture and multiply the pale winter light. The building's interior, when completed, exceeded even Albert's most optimistic expectations. The central nave stretched for nearly 2,000 feet, tall enough to accommodate the elm trees that had originally stood on the site, while smaller galleries branched off in all directions to house specialized exhibits. The effect was simultaneously vast and intimate, industrial and organic, creating spaces that seemed designed for contemplation as much as commerce. As opening day approached, exhibits began arriving from every corner of the world. Victoria and Albert spent hours each day inspecting the displays, marveling at the ingenuity and artistry represented in thousands of objects ranging from the most sophisticated machinery to the most delicate handicrafts. They saw steam engines that could power entire factories alongside silk carpets woven with patterns of incredible complexity, telescopes that could reveal distant galaxies alongside jewelry crafted from materials gathered on remote Pacific islands. The variety was overwhelming, yet patterns began to emerge that reflected Albert's deepest hopes for what the exhibition might accomplish. British exhibits, while impressive in their scale and technical sophistication, were displayed alongside contributions from other nations that demonstrated comparable levels of skill and creativity. The message was clear. Excellence was not the monopoly of any single nation, and progress would be fastest when knowledge and inspiration could flow freely across national boundaries. On the morning of May 1st, 1851, as Victoria prepared for the opening ceremony in her apartments at Buckingham Palace, she felt a mixture of pride and anxiety that reminded her of her coronation day 14 years earlier. Once again, she was about to participate in an event that would be remembered for generations. Yet this time, the achievement belonged as much to Albert as to herself. She had learned to see his successes as her own, just as he had always treated her triumphs as shared victories. The opening ceremony itself was a masterpiece of pageantry and purpose that reflected the exhibition's unique character. Victoria and Albert, accompanied by their children and a carefully chosen group of dignitaries representing the international character of the gathering, processed through the Crystal Palace's central nave, while a choir of 600 voices filled the vast space with Handel's Hallelujah chorus. The effect was overwhelming. The music seemed to rise and echo among the iron arches and glass walls like the prayers of a grateful humanity celebrating its own creative power. Victoria's speech at the opening ceremony was brief but perfectly chosen, emphasizing the exhibition's role in promoting peace and goodwill among all nations. She spoke of her hope that the gathered treasures would inspire visitors to appreciate the industry, energy, and talent that flourished in every corner of the world. And she expressed her confidence that such understanding would strengthen the bonds of international friendship and cooperation. The response exceeded even Albert's most optimistic projections. Over the 6 months that the exhibition remained open, more than 6 million visitors passed through the Crystal Palace's doors, number that represented nearly 1/3 of Britain's entire population. They came from every social class in every corner of the kingdom, traveling by the new railway networks that made such mass movement possible for the first time in human history. Victoria and Albert made countless visits to the exhibition, often arriving without fanfare to mingle with ordinary visitors and observe their reactions to the wonders on display. These informal visits became some of Victoria's most treasured memories of the entire enterprise. Watching a farm laborer marvel at agricultural machinery that could transform rural life, or seeing a group of factory workers examine textile equipment from distant countries and compare it with their own tools and techniques. The exhibition's success was measured not only in visitor numbers, but in the quality of international exchange it facilitated. Manufacturers discovered new markets for their products and new sources of raw materials for their industries. Artists and craftsmen found inspiration in techniques and styles they had never encountered before. Scientists and inventors formed relationships that will lead to collaborative research projects for decades to come. Most importantly, for Albert's larger vision, the exhibition demonstrated that international cooperation could produce results that benefited everyone involved. The profits from the exhibition were substantial enough to fund the establishment of educational institutions in South Kensington that would continue. Albert's work of promoting scientific and technical education for generations to come. Victoria watched Albert during these months of triumph with a love deepened by admiration for what he had accomplished. She saw how the exhibition's success vindicated his faith in human potential, how the peaceful cooperation it fostered confirmed his belief that nations could compete without destroying each other. In a confident way, he moved through the Crystal Palace, discussing technical innovations with visiting experts or explaining the significance of various exhibits to foreign dignitaries, showed her a man completely in his element, using his considerable abilities in service of causes larger than himself. The closing ceremony in October 1851 was touched with melancholy as well as celebration. The Crystal Palace would be dismantled and moved to South London, where it would serve other purposes for many years to come, but the unique gathering of the world's treasures would never be reassembled. Yet the memories and relationships formed during those 6 magical months would endure, influencing international trade, cultural exchange, and diplomatic cooperation for the remainder of Victoria's reign and beyond. As the last visitors departed and the great doors of the Crystal Palace closed for the final time, Victoria and Albert walked alone through the vast spaces that had witnessed such an extraordinary chapter in human history. The autumn light, filtering through the glass walls and casting long shadows across the empty floors, seemed to hold echoes of all the wonder and excitement that had filled those spaces during the preceding months. "We have shown the world what is possible," Albert said quietly, his voice carrying in the great emptiness. Victoria took his arm, understanding that he spoke not just of the exhibition itself, but of a larger vision. It represented a world where human creativity could flourish in peace, where nations could celebrate their differences while working together toward common goals, where progress could be measured not only in wealth and power, but in wisdom and mutual understanding. The winter of 1861 settled over Windsor Castle like a heavy gray blanket, bringing with it a chill that seemed to penetrate not just the ancient stones, but the very hearts of those who dwelt within. Albert had been unwell for weeks, a persistent exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to cure, a loss of appetite that gradually weakened his usually robust constitution. Victoria watched her beloved husband with growing anxiety, her medical consultations bringing reassurances that felt increasingly hollow as Albert's condition continued to deteriorate. For 21 years, Albert had been the steady center around which Victoria's world revolved. His quiet strength had supported her through every crisis. His wisdom had guided her through every difficult decision. His love had been the foundation upon which she had built not just her marriage, but her entire understanding of what it meant to be both woman and queen. The possibility that this bedrock of her existence might be threatened had never seriously occurred to her, despite the inevitable fragility that touches all human life. December brought no improvement in Albert's health, only a deepening fatigue that kept him increasingly confined to their private apartments. The man who had once filled every day with purposeful activity now spent long hours in his study, wrapped in blankets, trying to maintain his correspondence and official duties while struggling against a weakness that seemed to drain his vitality like water from a cracked vessel. Victoria's journal entries from these days reveal her growing desperation, masked by determined optimism. She recorded every slight improvement in Albert's condition, every moment when his appetite seemed to return or his energy appeared to rally. She consulted physicians, tried different treatments, rearranged their schedules to give Albert maximum rest while still fulfilling the minimum requirements of royal duty. Yet, beneath her hopeful observations lay a current of fear that she could not entirely suppress. On December 13th, Albert insisted on reviewing papers related to a diplomatic crisis with the United States, despite his obvious exhaustion. The Trent affair, involving the seizure of Confederate diplomats from a British ship, required careful handling to avoid war between Britain and America. Albert's modifications to the government's response, softening its language while maintaining Britain's dignity, would prove to be his final contribution to the peaceful conduct of international relations, fitting legacy for a man who had always believed that wisdom and moderation could resolve even the most dangerous conflicts. The next morning brought no improvement, and by evening, Albert's condition had clearly worsened. Victoria remained at his bedside through the night, holding his hand and speaking softly of their shared memories, of the children they had raised together, of the work they had accomplished in service of their people. Albert's responses grew weaker as the hours passed, but his eyes remained alert and full of love whenever they met Victoria's desperate gaze. December 14th, 1861, dawned gray and cold over Windsor Castle. Albert seemed to rally slightly in the morning, managing to take a little breakfast and exchange a few words with Victoria about the children's education and the management of their estates. But as afternoon faded into evening, it became clear that his strength was finally failing. Victoria summoned their older children to their father's bedside, understanding that the end was approaching with inexorable certainty. The scene that followed would remain forever etched in Victoria's memory. Albert, lying peacefully in their bed, surrounded by the family he had loved so devotedly, while the winter darkness gathered outside the windows of the room where they had shared so many quiet evenings of contentment. There was no dramatic struggle, no final crisis, simply the gradual fading of a great spirit that had given itself completely in service to love and duty. At 10 minutes before 11 o'clock that evening, Albert drew his final breath. Victoria, who had been holding his hand and speaking words of love, felt the exact moment when his spirit departed, leaving behind only the physical form of the man who had been her partner in everything that mattered. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft weeping of their children and the distant sound of wind in the castle's ancient trees. The immediate aftermath was a blur of necessary arrangements handled by others, while Victoria struggled to comprehend the magnitude of her loss. Albert's body was prepared for burial according to royal protocol, but Victoria could hardly bear to look at the still form that had once held such vibrant life. She retreated to their private apartments, surrounded by 1,000 reminders of their shared happiness, each object now transformed from a source of joy into a monument to irretrievable loss. Albert struggled to provide their children with as normal a childhood as possible, while preparing them for lives that would inevitably be lived in the public eye. Religious education formed an important part of the children's development, but Albert's approach emphasized the ethical and moral dimensions of faith rather than dogmatic adherence to particular doctrines. The family attended church services regularly, but their private devotions focused on developing compassion, integrity, and a sense of responsibility toward others less fortunate than themselves. As the children grew, Victoria began to understand that her greatest legacy might not be the political achievements of her reign, but the example she and Albert set as parents who balanced duty with love, authority with tenderness, and high expectations with unconditional acceptance. Their family life became a model that influenced not only their own subjects, but royal families throughout Europe and beyond. The portrait of family happiness that Victoria and Albert presented to the world was genuine rather than calculated for public consumption. Their love for each other and their children created an atmosphere of warmth and security that visitors to the palace could sense immediately. As foreign dignitaries, accustomed to the cold formality of many European courts, often commented on the natural ease and obvious affection that characterized the British royal family's interactions. Victoria's growth as a mother paralleled her development as a queen, each role informing and strengthening the other. The patience she learned from dealing with small children served her well in managing difficult ministers and diplomats. The protective instincts awakened by motherhood extended to encompass all her subjects, making her more sensitive to policies that affected families and children throughout the realm. In the crystalline dawn of May 1st, 1851, as the first rays of sunlight touched the revolutionary structure rising from Hyde Park, like a dream made manifest in iron and glass, London awakened to witness something unprecedented in human history. The great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations was about to open its doors, and with it, Prince Albert's grandest vision would be revealed to a wondering world. The idea had been germinating in Albert's mind for years, nurtured through countless conversations with Victoria, as they walked the grounds of Windsor or sat together in their private study after the children were asleep. He had observed the rapid changes transforming Britain and the world, the steam engines that were shrinking distances, the new manufacturing techniques that could produce goods in quantities previously unimaginable, the scientific discoveries that promised to reshape human understanding of everything from medicine to agriculture. What if Albert wondered aloud to Victoria during one of their evening conversations, all these marvels could be gathered in one place? What if the greatest achievements of human ingenuity from every corner of the earth could be displayed together, not as trophies of conquest, but as testimonies to the creative power that resided in all peoples? What if such an exhibition could demonstrate that competition need not mean conflict, that nations could strive to excel while remaining at peace? Victoria had listened to these dreams with growing excitement, her imagination caught by the scope of Albert's vision. She understood immediately that this would be more than a mere display of commercial goods. It would be a declaration of faith in human potential, a celebration of the peaceful cooperation that might be possible if nations chose wisdom over warfare, creativity over destruction. The challenges of bringing such a vision to reality seemed almost insurmountable. Where could such an enormous exhibition be housed? How could exhibits from dozens of countries be transported safely to London? How could visitors from around the world be accommodated? Most daunting of all, how could the enormous costs be covered without burdening the treasury or compromising the exhibition's international character? Albert threw himself into solving these problems with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all his undertakings. He formed committees, consulted experts, studied similar exhibitions that had been attempted on smaller scales in other countries. He spent hours poring over architectural drawings and engineering specifications, learning enough about construction techniques to participate meaningfully in discussions about the exhibition building that would need to house this unprecedented gathering. The solution came from an unexpected source: Joseph Paxton, a gardener and architect who had designed innovative greenhouse structures for the Duke of Devonshire. Paxton's proposal was breathtaking in its audacity, a building constructed almost entirely of iron and glass, large enough to enclose mature elm trees and tall enough to accommodate the largest industrial machinery, yet light and airy enough to feel more like a garden pavilion than a conventional building. When Albert first saw Paxton's plans spread across a table in the palace library while afternoon light streamed through the windows, he knew immediately that this crystalline palace would be the perfect embodiment of the exhibition's spirit. The building itself would demonstrate the possibilities of modern technology while maintaining a beauty and transparency that seemed to invite the whole world inside. Victoria, initially concerned about the enormous risks involved in supporting such an ambitious project, found her doubts dissolving as Albert shared his enthusiasm for Paxton's vision. She began to see the Crystal Palace, as it was soon dubbed by the press, as a symbol of everything she and Albert hoped their reign might accomplish: progress guided by wisdom, innovation balanced with beauty, British leadership expressed through service rather than domination. The months of preparation that followed tested Albert's diplomatic skills as thoroughly as his organizational abilities. Convincing foreign governments to participate required delicate negotiations that balanced commercial interests with national pride. Letters flowed from Albert's desk to royal courts and industrial centers around the world, each one carefully crafted to convey both the practical benefits and the larger significance of participation in this unprecedented gathering. Victoria supported these efforts with her own correspondence, writing personal letters to fellow monarchs and their ministers, using her position to open doors that might have remained closed to a private promoter. Her growing reputation for integrity and sincere commitment to peaceful cooperation gave weight to these invitations, helping to overcome the natural suspicions that might have greeted such an ambitious international project. As construction of the Crystal Palace proceeded through the winter of 1852-51, it became a source of fascination for Londoners who had never seen anything remotely like Paxton's revolutionary structure. Victoria and Albert made regular visits to Hyde Park, watching with wonder as the iron framework rose and the glass walls began to enclose vast spaces that seemed to capture and multiply the pale winter light. The building's interior, when completed, exceeded even Albert's most optimistic expectations. The central nave stretched for nearly 2,000 feet, tall enough to accommodate the elm trees that had originally stood on the site, while smaller galleries branched off in all directions to house specialized exhibits. The effect was simultaneously vast and intimate, industrial and organic, creating spaces that seemed designed for contemplation as much as commerce. As opening day approached, exhibits began arriving from every corner of the world. Victoria and Albert spent hours each day inspecting the displays, marveling at the ingenuity and artistry represented in thousands of objects ranging from the most sophisticated machinery to the most delicate handicrafts. They saw steam engines that could power entire factories alongside silk carpets woven with patterns of incredible complexity, telescopes that could reveal distant galaxies alongside jewelry crafted from materials gathered on remote Pacific islands. The variety was overwhelming, yet patterns began to emerge that reflected Albert's deepest hopes for what the exhibition might accomplish. British exhibits, while impressive in their scale and technical sophistication, were displayed alongside contributions from other nations that demonstrated comparable levels of skill and creativity. The message was clear. Excellence was not the monopoly of any single nation, and progress would be fastest when knowledge and inspiration could flow freely across national boundaries. On the morning of May 1st, 1851, as Victoria prepared for the opening ceremony in her apartments at Buckingham Palace, she felt a mixture of pride and anxiety that reminded her of her coronation day 14 years earlier. Once again, she was about to participate in an event that would be remembered for generations. Yet this time, the achievement belonged as much to Albert as to herself. She had learned to see his successes as her own, just as he had always treated her triumphs as shared victories. The opening ceremony itself was a masterpiece of pageantry and purpose that reflected the exhibition's unique character. Victoria and Albert, accompanied by their children and a carefully chosen group of dignitaries representing the international character of the gathering, Kira processed through the Crystal Palace's central nave, while a choir of 600 voices filled the vast space with Handel's Hallelujah chorus. The effect was overwhelming. The music seemed to rise and echo among the iron arches and glass walls like the prayers of a grateful humanity celebrating its own creative power. Victoria's speech at the opening ceremony was brief but perfectly chosen, emphasizing the exhibition's role in promoting peace and goodwill among all nations. She spoke of her hope that the gathered treasures would inspire visitors to appreciate the industry, energy, and talent that flourished in every corner of the world. And she expressed her confidence that such understanding would strengthen the bonds of international friendship and cooperation. The response exceeded even Albert's most optimistic projections. Over the 6 months that the exhibition remained open, more than 6 million visitors passed through the Crystal Palace's doors, number that represented nearly 1/3 of Britain's entire population. They came from every social class in every corner of the kingdom, traveling by the new railway networks that made such mass movement possible for the first time in human history. Victoria and Albert made countless visits to the exhibition, often arriving without fanfare to mingle with ordinary visitors and observe their reactions to the wonders on display. These informal visits became some of Victoria's most treasured memories of the entire enterprise, watching a farm laborer marvel at agricultural machinery that could transform rural life, or seeing a group of factory workers examine textile equipment from distant countries and compare it with their own tools and techniques. The exhibition's success was measured not only in visitor numbers, but in the quality of international exchange it facilitated. Manufacturers discovered new markets for their products and new sources of raw materials for their industries. Artists and craftsmen found inspiration in techniques and styles they had never encountered before. Scientists and inventors formed relationships that will lead to collaborative research projects for decades to come. Most importantly, for Albert's larger vision, the exhibition demonstrated that international cooperation could produce results that benefited everyone involved. The profits from the exhibition were substantial enough to fund the establishment of educational institutions in South Kensington that would continue. Albert's work of promoting scientific and technical education for generations to come. Victoria watched Albert during these months of triumph with a love deepened by admiration for what he had accomplished. She saw how the exhibition's success vindicated his faith in human potential, how the peaceful cooperation it fostered confirmed his belief that nations could compete without destroying each other. In a confident way, he moved through the Crystal Palace, discussing technical innovations with visiting experts or explaining the significance of various exhibits to foreign dignitaries, showed her a man completely in his element, using his considerable abilities in service of causes larger than himself. The closing ceremony in October 1851 was touched with melancholy as well as celebration. The Crystal Palace would be dismantled and moved to South London, where it would serve other purposes for many years to come, but the unique gathering of the world's treasures would never be reassembled. Yet the memories and relationships formed during those 6 magical months would endure, influencing international trade, cultural exchange, and diplomatic cooperation for the remainder of Victoria's reign and beyond. As the last visitors departed and the great doors of the Crystal Palace closed for the final time, Victoria and Albert walked alone through the vast spaces that had witnessed such an extraordinary chapter in human history. The autumn light, filtering through the glass walls and casting long shadows across the empty floors, seemed to hold echoes of all the wonder and excitement that had filled those spaces during the preceding months. "We have shown the world what is possible," Albert said quietly, his voice carrying in the great emptiness. Victoria took his arm, understanding that he spoke not just of the exhibition itself, but of a larger vision. It represented a world where human creativity could flourish in peace, where nations could celebrate their differences while working together toward common goals, where progress could be measured not only in wealth and power, but in wisdom and mutual understanding. The winter of 1861 settled over Windsor Castle like a heavy gray blanket, bringing with it a chill that seemed to penetrate not just the ancient stones, but the very hearts of those who dwelt within. Albert had been unwell for weeks, a persistent exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to cure, a loss of appetite that gradually weakened his usually robust constitution. Victoria watched her beloved husband with growing anxiety, her medical consultations bringing reassurances that felt increasingly hollow as Albert's condition continued to deteriorate. For 21 years, Albert had been the steady center around which Victoria's world revolved. His quiet strength had supported her through every crisis. His wisdom had guided her through every difficult decision. His love had been the foundation upon which she had built not just her marriage, but her entire understanding of what it meant to be both woman and queen. The possibility that this bedrock of her existence might be threatened had never seriously occurred to her, despite the inevitable fragility that touches all human life. December brought no improvement in Albert's health, only a deepening fatigue that kept him increasingly confined to their private apartments. The man who had once filled every day with purposeful activity now spent long hours in his study, wrapped in blankets, trying to maintain his correspondence and official duties while struggling against a weakness that seemed to drain his vitality like water from a cracked vessel. Victoria's journal entries from these days reveal her growing desperation, masked by determined optimism. She recorded every slight improvement in Albert's condition, every moment when his appetite seemed to return or his energy appeared to rally. She consulted physicians, tried different treatments, rearranged their schedules to give Albert maximum rest while still fulfilling the minimum requirements of royal duty. Yet, beneath her hopeful observations lay a current of fear that she could not entirely suppress. On December 13th, Albert insisted on reviewing papers related to a diplomatic crisis with the United States, despite his obvious exhaustion. The Trent affair, involving the seizure of Confederate diplomats from a British ship, required careful handling to avoid war between Britain and America. Albert's modifications to the government's response, softening its language while maintaining Britain's dignity, would prove to be his final contribution to the peaceful conduct of international relations, fitting legacy for a man who had always believed that wisdom and moderation could resolve even the most dangerous conflicts. The next morning brought no improvement, and by evening, Albert's condition had clearly worsened. Victoria remained at his bedside through the night, holding his hand and speaking softly of their shared memories, of the children they had raised together, of the work they had accomplished in service of their people. Albert's responses grew weaker as the hours passed, but his eyes remained alert and full of love whenever they met Victoria's desperate gaze. December 14th, 1861, dawned gray and cold over Windsor Castle. Albert seemed to rally slightly in the morning, managing to take a little breakfast and exchange a few words with Victoria about the children's education and the management of their estates. But as afternoon faded into evening, it became clear that his strength was finally failing. Victoria summoned their older children to their father's bedside, understanding that the end was approaching with inexorable certainty. The scene that followed would remain forever etched in Victoria's memory. Albert, lying peacefully in their bed, surrounded by the family he had loved so devotedly, while the winter darkness gathered outside the windows of the room where they had shared so many quiet evenings of contentment. There was no dramatic struggle, no final crisis, simply the gradual fading of a great spirit that had given itself completely in service to love and duty. At 10 minutes before 11 o'clock that evening, Albert drew his final breath. Victoria, who had been holding his hand and speaking words of love, felt the exact moment when his spirit departed, leaving behind only the physical form of the man who had been her partner in everything that mattered. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft weeping of their children and the distant sound of wind in the castle's ancient trees. The immediate aftermath was a blur of necessary arrangements handled by others, while Victoria struggled to comprehend the magnitude of her loss. Albert's body was prepared for burial according to royal protocol, but Victoria could hardly bear to look at the still form that had once held such vibrant life. She retreated to their private apartments, surrounded by 1,000 reminders of their shared happiness, each object now transformed from a source of joy into a monument to irretrievable loss. The funeral took place on December 23rd, just 9 days before Christmas, in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. The ceremony was conducted with all the solemnity appropriate to the passing of a prince consort. Yet Victoria could barely focus on the words and music that were meant to provide comfort. She sat in a chapel where she and Albert had worshipped together every Sunday for more than 20 years, surrounded by the tombs of monarchs who had lived and died centuries before, trying to accept that Albert had now joined their number in death's democracy. Christmas 1861 passed in a haze of grief that transformed what had always been the family's happiest season into a time of almost unbearable sorrow. The decorations that Albert had so enjoyed arranging remained unopened in their boxes. The gifts that had been prepared for the children were distributed without ceremony. The music room, where Albert's piano playing had been the heart of so many family gatherings, remained silent and closed. Victoria's grief was not the dramatic, temporary sorrow that might have been expected of a widow who could rely on others to manage her affairs. Instead, it was the profound, life-altering loss experienced by someone who had truly shared her deepest self with another person and must now learn to exist as only half of what had been a complete whole. Albert had been not just her husband, but her closest advisor, her intellectual companion, her moral guide, and her dearest friend. His death left gaps in her life that could never truly be filled. In the weeks that followed, Victoria made decisions that would shape the remainder of her reign. She would continue to serve as queen, fulfilling her constitutional duties with the same dedication Albert had always encouraged. But she would withdraw from the public ceremonies and social occasions that had once been an important part of royal life. The woman who had loved dancing at state balls and enjoyed meeting interesting people at palace receptions now found such activities not just distasteful, but almost impossible to endure. The Blue Room at Windsor Castle, where Albert had died, was preserved exactly as it had been at the moment of his death. Fresh flowers were placed there daily. His personal belongings remained undisturbed, and Victoria often spent hours in that room, sitting in the chair where she had maintained her vigil during his final days. To many observers, this preservation seemed morbid, but for Victoria, it was a necessary connection to the physical reality of their shared life, a way of maintaining some tangible link to the man who had been the center of her existence. Victoria's relationship with her children inevitably changed in the aftermath of Albert's death. The woman who had been a warm and engaged mother now struggled to provide the emotional support her grieving children needed while managing her own overwhelming sorrow. The older children, particularly Vicky and Bertie, found themselves trying to comfort their mother while dealing with their own profound loss of the father who had been so central to their development and education. The government business that Albert had helped Victoria manage with such skill now became a burden she carried alone. Reading official dispatches without Albert's insightful comments, receiving ministers without his wise counsel, making decisions without his careful analysis All these routine activities became painful reminders of how completely he had been integrated into every aspect of her reign. Yet Victoria persevered, understanding that abandoning her duties would dishonor Albert's memory and betray the principles he had taught her about service and dedication. Letters of condolence arrived from around the world, testimony to the respect Albert had earned through his years of devoted service to Britain in the international community. Monarchs, ministers, scientists, artists, and ordinary citizens wrote to express their sorrow at the loss of a man who had used his position to promote education, encourage the arts, and work for peaceful cooperation among nations. Reading these tributes, Victoria began to understand that her grief, while intensely personal, was shared by countless people who had benefited from Albert's vision and dedication. The monument Victoria planned for Albert became an obsession that helped focus her grief into purposeful activity. The Albert Memorial, eventually erected in Hyde Park, across from the site where the Crystal Palace had once stood, would be a testament not just to personal love, but to the public service that had characterized Albert's life. Every detail of the memorial's design was scrutinized by Victoria. Home wanted it to capture both Albert's individual character and his contributions to human progress. As winter gave way to spring in 1862, Victoria began the long process of learning to live with a loss that would never fully heal. She found solace in working to charitable causes Albert had supported in the educational institutions he had helped establish, in the continuing care of their children according to the principles he had taught her. She discovered that grief, while never disappearing entirely, could coexist with purpose, that love could continue to inspire service even after the beloved had departed. The black mourning dress that Victoria adopted after Albert's death became as much a part of her identity as the crown itself. For the remaining 40 years of her life, she would dress in the somber colors of mourning, not as a morbid fixation on death, but as a visible reminder of a love that had been the defining experience of her life. The widow of Windsor, as she came to be known, carried her grief with dignity while continuing to serve her people with the dedication Albert had always encouraged. Victoria's journals from the months following Albert's death revealed a woman struggling to find meaning in a world that had suddenly become strange and threatening. Yet, even in her darkest moments, she returned again and again to gratitude for the 21 years of happiness she and Albert had shared, for the children they had raised together, for the work they had accomplished in partnership. Her grief was profound because her love had been profound a testament to the depth of human connection that can transcend even death's finality. In the hushed corridors of Windsor Castle, where Albert's presence had once brought such vibrant life, Victoria now moved like a figure from a medieval painting draped in black silk. Her steps measured and deliberate, carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone learning to bear an impossible weight. The years immediately following Albert's death transformed not just Victoria's appearance, but the very rhythm of her daily existence. She discovered that grief could become a kind of sacred duty, a way of honoring love by refusing to let it be forgotten. The routine she established in those early months of widowhood would remain largely unchanged for the rest of her life. Each morning began in the Blue Room where Albert had died, with Victoria spending quiet moments among his belongings, as if drawing strength from the physical remnants of their shared life. His morning coat still hung in the wardrobe. His books remained open to the pages he had been reading. His papers lay arranged as he had left them on that final December evening. As two visitors, this preservation might have seemed morbid, but for Victoria, it was a necessary ritual, a way of beginning each day with remembrance rather than forgetting. The business of government continued, but it took on a different character as Victoria adapted her methods to accommodate her changed circumstances. She could no longer bear the extended audiences and lengthy meetings that had once filled her calendar. So she increasingly conducted official business through written correspondence. Her private secretaries found themselves managing a vast stream of letters, memoranda, and official papers that flowed between Victoria and her ministers, her governors throughout the empire, and the countless petitioners who sought her attention. This shift toward written communication actually enhanced Victoria's effectiveness as a constitutional monarch in many ways. Her letters were carefully considered, often revised multiple times before being sent, and they carried a weight and formality that spoken words might have lacked. Ministers who had once been able to charm or cajole Victoria in person now faced the full force of her written arguments. Her detailed knowledge of precedent and her unwavering commitment to what she saw as right and proper conduct. Victoria's withdrawal from public ceremonies became one of the most controversial aspects of her widowhood. Yet it reflected her genuine inability to participate in celebrations and social occasions without feeling overwhelmed by memories of Albert's presence. The state opening of Parliament, which had once been a highlight of the royal calendar, now took place without the Queen's attendance. State dinners were cancelled or drastically simplified. The elaborate court presentations that had introduced young women to society were suspended indefinitely. Yet this physical withdrawal did not mean disengagement from her responsibilities as sovereign. Victoria continued to read every important state paper, to meet with her prime ministers regularly, and to maintain extensive correspondence with other European monarchs. Her influence on British policy remained substantial, perhaps even increased by the mystique that surrounded her seclusion and the widely known depth of her devotion to Albert's memory. The management of the royal estates became Victoria's particular focus during these years, as she threw herself into preserving and improving the properties that she and Albert had developed together. Sporn House on the Isle of Wight required constant attention, its gardens needing care to maintain the elaborate landscaping that Albert had designed. Balmoral Castle in Scotland, which Albert had rebuilt according to his vision of Highland architecture, became Victoria's retreat from the pressures of official life, a place where she could walk the hills and breathe the clear air while feeling closest to Albert's spirit. Her relationship with her children evolved necessarily as Victoria learned to be both mother and, in some sense, father to young people who were struggling with their own grief, trying to understand their mother's profound withdrawal from normal family life. The older children, Vicky, who had married the Crown Prince of Prussia, and Bertie, who was coming of age as heir to the throne, found themselves dealing with a mother who loved them deeply, but could no longer express that love with the warmth and spontaneity that had characterized their earlier family life. Victoria's determination to preserve Albert's influence over their children became almost an obsession during these years. She frequently reminded them of their father's wishes, his expectations, his plans for their education and future careers. Albert's notebooks and memoranda became sacred texts that guided decisions about everything from marriage partners to career choices. The younger children, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice, grew up in a household where their deceased father's presence was more palpable than that of many living parents. Alice, Victoria's third child, emerged during these difficult years as her mother's closest emotional support. Unlike Vicky, who was now living in Prussia and dealing with her own complex political situation, or Bertie, whose easygoing nature sometimes frustrated Victoria's intense seriousness. Alice possessed a deep empathy and understanding that made her uniquely suited to comfort her grieving mother. She would spend hours with Victoria, reading aloud from Albert's favorite books, helping to organize his papers, or simply sitting quietly while Victoria worked on her correspondence. The Scottish Highlands became Victoria's refuge during the long months of each year, when she could escape from the formal requirements of Windsor and Buckingham Palace. At Balmoral, surrounded by the wild beauty that Albert had loved so deeply, Victoria found a peace that was impossible in more populated areas. She would take long walks across the moors, often accompanied only by her faithful Highland servant John Brown, whose bluff honesty and lack of court formality provided a refreshing contrast to the careful deference of most royal attendants. John Brown's relationship with Victoria became the subject of considerable speculation and some scandal among those who couldn't understand how a queen could form such a close friendship with a man so far below her in social station. Yet for Victoria, Brown's straightforward manner and genuine concern for her welfare provided exactly the kind of uncomplicated human connection she needed during her years of deepest grief. He treated her not as a remote sovereign, but as a woman who had suffered a terrible loss and needed practical support to get through each day. The cottage at Glassaltschiel, deep in the Highlands, where Victoria and Albert had once spent their most private and happiest hours together, became a shrine to their love that Victoria visited regularly during her Scottish sojourns. Here, far from the eyes of courtiers and the demands of official duty, she could sit by the stream where Albert had once sketched Highland scenes, or walk the paths where they had discussed their dreams for their children's futures and their hopes for the empire they served together. Victoria's writing during these years took on new dimensions as she began work on what would become a massive biographical project dedicated to preserving Albert's memory and explaining his contributions to British life. The early years of His Royal Highness, the Prince Consort, came a labor of love that occupied countless hours and resulted in a detailed portrait of the man who had been her partner in everything that mattered. The book, published in 1867, was both a personal tribute and a public statement about the kind of leadership Albert had provided during his 21 years as her consort. The process of writing about Albert forced Victoria to examine their relationship with a kind of detailed attention she had never applied while he was alive. Reading through his letters, studying his speeches and memoranda, interviewing people who had worked with him on various projects, she began to understand even more fully the scope of his contributions to British society. His work on educational reform, his promotion of scientific research, his efforts to improve working conditions for ordinary people, all of these achievements took on new significance as Victoria documented them for posterity. International affairs continued to require Victoria's attention during these years of withdrawal, though she now conducted most of her diplomatic correspondence from the privacy of her study, rather than through personal meetings with foreign dignitaries. Her letters to other European monarchs carried particular weight because of the respect she had earned through her years of consistent, principled leadership. When wars threatened to break out between her relatives who ruled various German states, Victoria's counsel often helped to find peaceful solutions that honored everyone's dignity while avoiding bloodshed. The American Civil War, which had begun just months before Albert's death, continued to present challenges that required delicate handling. Victoria's government maintained official neutrality while dealing with pressures from both Union and Confederate sympathizers in Britain. Victoria's own sympathies lay with the Union cause, particularly after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which aligned with her and Albert's long-standing opposition to slavery. Yet, she understood that Britain's economic interests required careful balancing of competing pressures, and her guidance helped her ministers navigate these treacherous waters. The death of her mother, the Duchess of Kent, in March 1861, 18 months before Albert's own passing, had already begun the process of isolating Victoria from the family connections that had sustained her through her early years. The Duchess had been a difficult woman in many ways, overprotective and sometimes manipulative. But she had also been a link to Victoria's childhood and to the German relatives who formed such an important part of her extended family network. Her death left Victoria feeling more alone even before Albert's passing made that loneliness complete. The question of Bertie's marriage became a source of both hope and anxiety during these years, as Victoria struggled to find a bride who would meet Albert's exacting standards, while also appealing to her pleasure-loving eldest son. Princess Alexandra of Denmark eventually emerged as the ideal candidate, beautiful, well-educated, possessed of the kind of moral character that Albert would have admired, yet warm and engaging enough to capture Bertie's affections. Their wedding in March 1863 provided one of the few bright moments in Victoria's otherwise somber existence during this period. Victoria's attendance at Bertie's wedding marked one of her rare public appearances during the early years of her widowhood, and the sight of the Queen in her black mourning dress Watching her son's happiness with a mixture of joy and profound sadness became one of the most memorable images of her entire reign. She had insisted that Albert's presence be acknowledged during the ceremony through music he had loved and readings he had chosen, making the wedding both a celebration of new beginnings and a memorial to irretrievable loss. The empire continued to expand during these years, though Victoria's role in its administration became more indirect as she focused on written guidance rather than direct involvement in policy formation. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, which had occurred while Albert was still alive to help her understand its complexities, had demonstrated the need for more sophisticated approaches to governing diverse populations across vast distances. Victoria's instinctive sympathy for her Indian subjects, combined with Albert's influence toward justice and fair dealing, had helped shape a more enlightened approach to imperial administration. As the 1860s progressed, Victoria began to find ways of channeling her grief into productive activities that honored Albert's memory while serving useful purposes. The establishment of the Albert Memorial and the construction of the Royal Albert Hall became major projects that occupied her attention and provided tangible expressions of her determination to ensure that Albert's contributions would never be forgotten. Every detail of these monuments was scrutinized by Victoria, who wanted them to capture both the personal loss she had suffered and the public service that had characterized Albert's life. The Royal Albert Hall, in particular, represented Albert's vision of education and cultural enrichment made manifest in brick and stone. Victoria's involvement in its planning and construction gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life since Albert's death. When the hall finally opened in 1871, 10 years after Albert's passing, Victoria was able to attend the ceremony with something approaching her old enthusiasm. Seeing in the building's soaring spaces and excellent acoustics a fitting tribute to Albert's belief in the power of music and learning to elevate human experience. The gradual acceptance of her loss that Victoria achieved during these quiet years was not a matter of getting over Albert's death, but rather of learning to live with grief as a permanent companion that could coexist with purpose, duty, and even moments of satisfaction. She discovered that love could continue to inspire action even after the beloved had departed. The principles Albert had taught her could guide her decisions, even when she could no longer seek his advice directly. As the 1870s dawned across the vast territories that acknowledged Victoria's sovereignty, the sun truly never set on an empire that stretched from the foggy shores of Britain to the sun-baked plains of India, from the frozen territories of Canada to the gold fields of Australia. Yet for all its global reach, this empire was guided by a woman who rarely left the British Isles, who conducted her imperial duties from the quiet studies of Windsor Castle and Balmoral, her influence flowing across oceans through carefully crafted letters and thoughtfully chosen representatives. Victoria's understanding of her role as Empress, a title officially granted to her in 1876, was profoundly shaped by Albert's teachings about service and responsibility. She had learned from him that true authority came not from the power to command, but from the wisdom to guide. Not from the ability to dominate, but from the capacity to protect and nurture. His philosophy transformed what might have been a harsh and exploitative empire into something more complex and, in many ways, more humane. The jewel in this imperial crown was India, that vast subcontinent with its ancient civilizations, diverse peoples, and incalculable wealth. The memories of the Indian Rebellion of 1857 still cast shadows over British rule, but Victoria's approach to her Indian subjects reflected a maternal concern that surprised many of her contemporaries. She insisted on learning Hindi phrases, collected Indian art and artifacts with genuine appreciation, and regularly received Indian visitors at court with the same ceremony accorded to European dignitaries. Her fascination with India deepened when she acquired the services of Mohammed Abdul Karim, known as the Munshi, who taught her Hindustani and served as her guide to understanding Indian culture and perspectives. The relationship scandalized the British establishment, who could not comprehend why their queen would spend hours each day studying with a man they considered racially and socially inferior. Yet Victoria persisted, finding in these lessons not just linguistic knowledge, but insights into the minds and hearts of the millions of people who called her Empress. The letters Victoria wrote to her Indian viceroys revealed a ruler who saw herself as a protector rather than exploiter of her distant subjects. She regularly inquired about famine relief efforts, educational improvements, and the treatment of Indian civil servants and soldiers. When racial tensions arose, as they frequently did, Victoria's guidance consistently emphasized justice and fairness over the prejudices that many of her British subjects brought to imperial administration. Canada presented different challenges and opportunities for Victoria's imperial vision. The Confederation of British North American Colonies into the Dominion of Canada in 1867 created a new model of imperial relationship, one that granted substantial self-government while maintaining ties of loyalty and affection to the Crown. Victoria's correspondence with Canadian Governors-General showed her understanding that the Empire's future lay not in rigid control from London, but in the evolution of mature partnerships between Britain and its former colonies. The vast territories of Australia and New Zealand offered laboratories for social experiments that fascinated Victoria and would have delighted Albert. Okay, these colonies were developing democratic institutions, expanding educational opportunities, and creating societies that, while still marked by the inequalities of their time, showed promise of greater fairness and mobility than the more rigid class structures of Europe. Victoria followed these developments with keen interest, seeing in the colonial experiments potential models for reform in Britain itself. South Africa presented more troubling challenges as competing populations of British settlers, Dutch, Afrikaners, and indigenous African peoples struggled for control of land and resources. Victoria's correspondence during the various South African conflicts revealed her discomfort with purely military solutions and her preference for negotiated settlements that would respect the legitimate interests of all parties. Yet, she also understood that the strategic importance of the Cape Colony and the wealth of the diamond fields made some form of British control seem necessary for imperial security. The smaller colonies scattered across the globe, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malta, Gibraltar. The West Indies age presented unique challenges that tested Victoria's ability to govern diverse peoples with wisdom and compassion. Her approach was consistently to seek administrators who would serve with integrity, to insist on policies that promoted education and economic development, and to maintain the delicate balance between local autonomy and imperial unity. Victoria's imperial correspondence during these years reveals a ruler who thought in terms of centuries rather than decades, who understood that empires built on force alone could not endure, but that those founded on mutual benefit and genuine care for subject peoples might evolve into lasting partnerships. Her letters to colonial governors consistently emphasized the importance of justice, education, and gradual preparation for self-government as the ultimate goals of imperial administration. The expansion of telegraph communications during this period revolutionized Victoria's ability to govern her far-flung territories. Messages that had once taken months to travel between London and India could now be transmitted in hours, allowing for much more detailed and immediate consultation on important decisions. Victoria adapted enthusiastically to this new technology, maintaining regular telegraphic correspondence with her viceroys and governors general that kept her closely informed about developments across her empire. Yet for all the technological improvements in communication, Victoria understood that effective imperial governance required more than rapid message transmission. It required administrators who understood and respected the peoples they served, policies that promoted long-term stability rather than short-term exploitation, and a vision of imperial purpose that went beyond mere wealth extraction or strategic advantage. The question of imperial trade occupied much of Victoria's attention during these years, as she sought to balance the commercial interests of British merchants and manufacturers with the welfare of colonial populations. She consistently supported policies that would develop colonial economies in ways that benefited local peoples as well as British investors, understanding that prosperous and contented colonies be more loyal and more stable than those that felt exploited or neglected. Victoria's interest in missionary activities throughout the empire reflected her belief that moral and spiritual development should accompany material progress. Yet her approach to religious questions in the colonies showed the influence of Albert's broad tolerance and respect for diverse traditions, while she supported Christian missionary work. She also insisted that colonial administrators respect local religious practices and avoid the kind of heavy-handed proselytizing that had contributed to the Indian Rebellion. The gradual abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire had begun before Victoria's reign, but continued during her early years on the throne, represented one of the achievements of which she was most proud. Her correspondence with colonial governors consistently emphasized the importance of ensuring that former slaves enjoyed genuine freedom and opportunities for advancement, not merely formal emancipation that left them vulnerable to other forms of exploitation. Educational development across the empire became one of Victoria's particular interests during these years. She saw in the expansion of learning the key to eventual self-government and continuing imperial partnership. She regularly inquired about the establishment of schools and universities, the training of local teachers, and the translation of educational materials into local languages. Her vision of imperial education was notably inclusive, encompassing both British subjects of European descent and indigenous populations who had previously been excluded from formal learning opportunities. The challenges of governing such a diverse empire were immense, requiring constant balancing of competing interests and conflicting values. Victoria's correspondence reveals a ruler who understood that perfect solutions were rarely possible, but who consistently saw policies that would promote justice, stability, and gradual progress toward greater freedom and self-determination for all her subjects. The personal cost of imperial responsibility weighed heavily on Victoria during these years. She felt the burden of accountability for the welfare of hundreds of millions of people she would never meet, living in circumstances she could only imagine through the reports of others. Yet she found satisfaction in the knowledge that her decisions could improve lives, that her influence could promote justice, and that her empire, however imperfect, was evolving toward more humane and enlightened forms of governance. As the 1870s progressed, Victoria began to see herself not merely as Queen of the United Kingdom, but as the maternal figure of a global family of peoples who looked to her for protection, guidance, and care. This vision of imperial motherhood, while paternalistic by modern standards, represented a genuine attempt to exercise power with compassion and to use Britain's global dominance in service of human progress rather than mere national aggrandizement. In the gentle morning light of June 20th, 1887, exactly 50 years after that young girl had been awakened at Kensington Palace to learn she was queen, Victoria rose at Windsor Castle to face a day unlike any in British history. Half a century of reign stretched behind her like a vast tapestry woven with threads of triumph and sorrow, progress and loss, duty faithfully discharged through decades of change that had transformed not just Britain, but the entire world. The woman who prepared for her golden jubilee. Celebrations bore little resemblance to the 18-year-old who had once stood barefoot in her nightgown to receive the homage of elderly counselors. Victoria, at 68, was a figure of almost mythical authority, her small frame clothed perpetually in black silk, her white hair arranged with simple dignity beneath the widow's cap she had worn for 26 years. Yet her eyes remained bright with intelligence and purpose, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of 5 decades spent in service to her people. The months leading up to the Jubilee had been filled with preparations that reflected the global scope of Victoria's reign. Messages of congratulation arrived from every corner of the earth, from Maharajas in India and tribal chiefs in Africa, and from presidents of republics and fellow monarchs of ancient dynasties, from ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by the long stability and general prosperity that had, characterize the Victorian age. Victoria approached these celebrations with mixed feelings that she confided to her journal in the quiet hours before dawn. The public festivities, she knew, were not really about her as an individual, but about the institution of monarchy she had served for so long, and the nation she had helped guide through an era of unprecedented change. Yet she could not help reflecting on all that had been gained and lost during her 50 years on the throne, on the faces that were missing from the celebration and the dreams that remained unfulfilled. Albert's absence cast its familiar shadow over even this moment of triumph. Victoria could not look at the decorations being prepared, could not hear the bands practicing their ceremonial music, without remembering how much Albert would have enjoyed the organizational challenges and symbolic opportunities presented by such a grand occasion. She had learned to carry such moments of sadness alongside her public joy, understanding that great happiness and deep sorrow could coexist in the same heart without diminishing either. The Jubilee service at Westminster Abbey on June 21st brought together a congregation that represented not just British society, but the global community that looked to Victoria as sovereign or symbol. Indian princes sat beside European royalty. Colonial governors shared pews with cabinet ministers. Representatives of every faith and nation within the empire gathered to honor a queen who had become, in many ways, the living embodiment of her age. Victoria's entrance into the abbey, supported by two of her sons and moving slowly due to her arthritis, but carrying herself with unmistakable dignity, prompted a response that moved even skeptical observers. The ancient building seemed to hold its breath as this small, black-clad figure made her way to the chair where she had been crowned 50 years earlier, now worn smooth by centuries of ceremony, but still capable of conferring the mystical authority that transforms ordinary humans into symbols of something larger than themselves. The service itself balanced thanksgiving for the past with prayers for the future, acknowledging both the achievements and the imperfections of Victoria's long reign. The music including compositions by Handel that Albert had particularly loved filled the abbey's soaring spaces with harmonies that seemed to echo across the centuries, connecting this moment to all the great occasions that have been celebrated within these walls since medieval times. Yet it was not the formal ceremony that moved Victoria most deeply, but the spontaneous demonstrations of affection she encountered during her carriage procession through London's streets afterward. The crowds that lined her route represented every class and condition of British society, from titled aristocrats watching from decorated balconies to working families who had saved for months to afford a place along the route. Their cheers followed Victoria's carriage like a river of sound, carrying decades of accumulated respect and genuine affection for a sovereign who had shared their sorrows and celebrated their triumphs. The decorations that transformed London for the Jubilee reflected the prosperity and confidence that had characterized much of Victoria's reign. Streets were draped with bunting in the royal colors. Buildings were illuminated with gas lamps arranged in elaborate patterns. And triumphal arches celebrated everything from military victories to industrial achievements to the expansion of democratic rights that had marked the Victorian era. The international character of the celebrations reflected Britain's global role and Victoria's personal connections to royal families throughout Europe. Her children and grandchildren, now scattered across the continent as rulers or consorts of various nations, had gathered in London to honor their mother and grandmother. The sight of these royal relatives, representing the complex web of dynastic marriages that still played an important role in European diplomacy, reminded observers that Victoria was not just Britain's queen, but the matriarch of European royalty. The state banquet that followed the Abbey service brought together 800 guests, representing every aspect of British and imperial life. Victoria, who had eaten little during the day due to excitement and fatigue, found herself seated among people whose careers and achievements represented the best of her reign. Scientists whose discoveries had advanced human knowledge. Artists whose works had enriched British culture. Administrators whose service had built and maintained the empire. Military leaders whose courage had defended British interests around the world, gathered to honor the sovereign who had presided over their various contributions to human progress. The gifts presented to Victoria during the Jubilee celebrations created a museum of imperial craftsmanship and artistic achievement. From India came textiles of incredible beauty and complexity, their patterns telling stories of ancient traditions adapted to modern techniques. Australia contributed specimens of unique flora and fauna that demonstrated the natural wonders of that distant continent. Canada offered products of its forests and mines, while South Africa provided diamonds that captured and reflected light like crystallized starfire. Yet, among all these magnificent offerings, Victoria was most moved by the simpler gifts that represented the personal affection of ordinary subjects. A group of Welsh miners had contributed money to commission a specially bound book of poetry by their countrymen. Scottish Highland regiments had prepared an illuminated address written in Gaelic and English that celebrated Victoria's love for their homeland. Children from London's East End had created a scrapbook filled with their own drawings and compositions, showing scenes of daily life that revealed both the hardships and the hopes of Britain's urban poor. The week of Jubilee celebrations continued with events that showcased different aspects of British achievement during Victoria's reign. A naval review at Spithead demonstrated the maritime power that protected British commerce and communications across the globe. Industrial exhibitions displayed the technological innovations that had made Britain the workshop of the world. Its cultural performances celebrated the literature, music, and art that had flourished during the Victorian age. Victoria participated in as many of these events as her health and energy permitted, understanding that her presence transformed routine celebrations into occasions of historical significance. Yet, she also carved out private moments for reflection on the deeper meanings of the milestone she was marking. In the quiet hours after the public events ended each day, she would sit in her study at Windsor, writing in her journal and reviewing the letters and telegrams that continued to arrive from every corner of the world. The international press coverage of the Jubilee demonstrated the extent to which Victoria had become a global figure who transcended the boundaries of nationality and politics. American newspapers, despite their nation's republican principles, wrote admiringly of a queen who had presided over her country's transformation from a primarily agricultural society to an industrial power. French journalists, despite centuries of Anglo-French rivalry, acknowledged Victoria's role in maintaining European peace through her diplomatic correspondence and family connections. The Jubilee also prompted serious reflection on the changes that had transformed British society during Victoria's reign. The Britain of 1887 was almost unrecognizable compared to the country she had inherited in 1837. Railways had shrunk distances and connected previously isolated communities. Telegraph lines carried information across continents in hours rather than months. Gaslighting had transformed urban life, while new sanitation systems had dramatically improved public health. More importantly, the expansion of democratic rights had given ordinary citizens a voice in their governance that would have been unimaginable at the beginning of Victoria's reign. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, to 1884 had gradually extended voting rights to larger portions of the population, while the secret ballot had protected voters from intimidation and corruption. These changes had occurred peacefully, without the violent revolutions that had swept across Europe, partly because of the stability and continuity that Victoria's reign had provided. The social reforms of the Victorian Era, abolition of slavery throughout the empire, the restriction of child labor, the establishment of public education, the improvement of working conditions in factories and mines represented a gradual but genuine progress toward a more just and humane society. While much remained to be accomplished, the direction of change was clearly toward greater equality and broader opportunity for all British subjects. As the formal Jubilee celebrations drew to a close, Victoria found herself looking both backward and forward with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. The achievements of her 50-year reign were substantial and worthy of celebration. Yet she understood that the challenges facing Britain and the Empire were far from resolved. The rise of new industrial powers, particularly Germany and the United States, threatened Britain's economic dominance. Social tensions within British society continued to simmer beneath the surface prosperity. The empire itself faced growing pressures for greater autonomy from colonies that had outgrown their dependent status. Yet, Victoria's predominant feeling as she reflected on her golden Jubilee was one of gratitude for the opportunity to serve, for the support of her people through decades of change and challenge, for the privilege of presiding over an era that had seen remarkable progress in human knowledge and social organization. She had learned to see her reign not as a series of personal achievements, but as a chapter in the larger story of human development, a story that would continue long after her own part in it had ended. As the 19th century drew toward its close, Victoria entered the final phase of her extraordinary reign with the measured dignity of someone who had learned to balance the weight of accumulated years against the continuing demands of duty. The decade of the 1890s would prove to be a time of both triumph and testing. As the aging queen navigated the complex currents of a world that was changing more rapidly than ever before, while maintaining the steady presence that had become the anchor of British life, the Diamond Jubilee of 1897, marking 60 years on the throne, surpassed even the Golden Jubilee in its scope and splendor. Victoria, now 78 years old and increasingly frail, nonetheless summoned the strength to participate in celebrations that demonstrated not just Britain's power, but the genuine affection in which she was held by peoples around the world. The sight of the small, black-clad figure in her carriage, acknowledging the cheers of millions who lined the streets of London, became one of the defining images of the age that bore her name. Yet, behind the public pageantry, these final years of Victoria's reign were marked by a profound sense of transition and impending change. The Queen, who had once been criticized for her withdrawal from public life, now found herself struggling with physical limitations that made even routine appearances increasingly difficult. Her arthritis had worsened with age, making movement painful and uncertain. Her eyesight, while still adequate for reading, no longer permitted the detailed attention to documents that had once characterized her approach to government business. The deaths of old friends and valued servants created an atmosphere of gentle melancholy around Victoria's daily life during these years. John Brown, her devoted Highland attendant, had died in 1883, leaving a gap in her personal household that was never quite filled. Other longtime companions followed him into the quiet realm of memory, each departure reminding Victoria of her own mortality, while deepening her appreciation for the relationships that remained. Yet new figures entered Victoria's life during these later years, bringing fresh energy and different perspectives to her increasingly limited world. Ku de Munshi Abdul Karim continued to serve as her teacher and cultural interpreter, helping her maintain connection with a vast Indian population that looked to her as empress. His presence at court remained controversial among traditional courtiers, but Victoria's determination to honor their relationship demonstrated her continued independence of judgment, even in advanced age. The empire that Victoria had inherited as a collection of scattered territories had evolved into a complex global system that required increasingly sophisticated management. The growth of national consciousness in various colonies, the rise of new economic powers that challenged British dominance, and the emergence of international tensions that threatened the peaceful cooperation Victoria had always promoted. All these developments demanded careful attention from a monarch whose personal experience spanned more than half a century of imperial evolution. Victoria's correspondence during these years reveals a ruler who understood that the empire's future lay not in rigid control from London, but in the gradual evolution toward partnership and eventual independence for those colonies that had developed the capacity for self-government. Her letters to colonial governors and Dominion prime ministers consistently emphasized the importance of maintaining connections based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than mere administrative convenience or economic exploitation. The technological marvels that continued to emerge during the 1890s fascinated Victoria, who had lived through the transition from a world of horse-drawn transport and candlelight to one of railways, to telegraphs and electric illumination. The development of the telephone allowed her to speak directly with officials in distant parts of Britain, while improved photography meant that she could see detailed images of places and peoples throughout her empire without leaving her study at Windsor or Balmoral. Yet, for all her interest in technological progress, Victoria remained grounded in the human relationships that had always been the foundation of her approach to monarchy. Her extensive family, now scattered across Europe as rulers and consorts of various nations, continued to provide both personal satisfaction and political complexity. The marriages of her children and grandchildren had created a web of dynastic connections that made Victoria the grandmother of Europe, but also meant that family disputes could become international incidents requiring delicate diplomatic handling. The German question became increasingly troubling during these final years of Victoria's reign. Her eldest grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had inherited the German throne with ambitions that seemed to threaten the European balance of power that Victoria had worked so hard to maintain. Her correspondence with Wilhelm revealed a grandmother's concern for a young man whose talents were undeniable, but whose judgments seemed increasingly erratic and dangerous. The Boer War, which began in 1899, presented Victoria with one of the most challenging situations of her entire reign. The conflict in South Africa pitted British forces against Dutch settlers, whose courage and determination earned grudging respect even from their enemies. Victoria's natural sympathies lay with her own troops, but her correspondence reveals deep concern about the methods being used and the long-term consequences for imperial policy. She understood that victories achieved through excessive force might prove to be defeats in the larger struggle for imperial legitimacy and moral authority. Victoria's health during these final years required increasingly careful management, though she continued to insist on fulfilling her essential duties as sovereign. Her appearances at public events became more limited and carefully choreographed, but her influence on government policy remained substantial. Prime ministers found that consultations with the Queen, while necessarily brief, continued to provide insights and perspectives that came only from decades of experience in managing the complex relationships that held the empire together. The question of succession, while never openly discussed, cast its inevitable shadow over the final years of Victoria's reign. Her son Bertie, now nearly 60 years old himself, had spent his entire adult life preparing for responsibilities that seemed perpetually deferred by his mother's remarkable longevity. Victoria's relationship with her heir remained complex, mixing genuine affection with persistent concern about his judgment and his very different approach to royal duties. The changing social and political landscape of Britain itself presented challenges that required adaptation of traditional monarchical approaches. The growth of trade unions, the emergence of socialist political movements, and the increasing demands for women's rights all reflected social forces that Victoria had to understand and respond to. Okay? Even when they challenged assumptions that had guided her throughout her reign. Yet Victoria's approach to these challenges reflected the wisdom she had accumulated through decades of experience in managing social change. Rather than simply resisting innovation, she sought to channel it in directions that would strengthen rather than undermine the institutions she had served so long. Support for modest reforms, her encouragement of education and social improvement, and her consistent emphasis on moral leadership helped maintain the monarchy's relevance in a rapidly changing world. The literary and artistic achievements that flourished during the final decade of Victoria's reign provided fitting accompaniment to the conclusion of an era that had seen unprecedented creativity in British culture. Writers like Thomas Hardy and Oscar Wilde, artists like John Singer Sargent and James McNeill Whistler, composers like Edward Elgar and Arthur Sullivan contributed to a cultural renaissance that demonstrated the continued vitality of British civilization, even as the political certainties of the mid-Victorian period began to give way to newer and more complex arrangements. Victoria's personal reading during these years reflected both nostalgia for the past and curiosity about the future. She continued to enjoy novels, particularly those that portrayed characters facing moral challenges with courage and integrity. Poetry remained a source of comfort, especially works that dealt with themes of memory, loss, and the enduring power of love to transcend death. Her own journal writing, which had been a daily practice for more than 60 years, became an increasingly important way of processing the complex emotions that came with watching a familiar world transform itself into something strange and new. The Diamond Jubilee celebrations in 1897 provided a magnificent culmination to these themes of continuity and change. The procession through London that marked the occasion included representatives from every corner of the empire, creating a living tableau of the diversity and extent of British influence around the world. Victoria, riding in her carriage through streets decorated with unprecedented splendor, saw reflected in the faces of her subjects not just loyalty and affection, but genuine gratitude for the stability and progress that had characterized her long reign. The international response to the Diamond Jubilee demonstrated the extent to which Victoria had become not just a British monarch, but a global symbol of successful constitutional government. Messages of congratulation arrived from republics as well as monarchies, from former enemies as well as traditional allies, acknowledging the remarkable achievement of a reign that had lasted longer than most people's entire lifetimes, while maintaining both popular support and effective governance. As the celebrations concluded and normal routines resumed, Victoria faced the final years of her reign with a mixture of satisfaction and concern that reflected her realistic assessment of both achievements and continuing challenges. She had presided over the transformation of Britain from a primarily agricultural nation to the world's first industrial society. She had guided the evolution of the empire from a collection of territories held by force into a community of nations bound by increasingly voluntary ties. She had maintained constitutional government while adapting it to the needs of a democratic age. Yet she also understood that the world was entering a period of uncertainty and potential conflict that would test all the institutions and relationships she had worked so hard to build and maintain. The rise of new powers, the emergence of new technologies of destruction, and the growing complexity of international relationships all suggested that the relatively peaceful and stable world of the later Victorian era might not survive much longer. As the year 1900 dawned across the British Empire, bringing with it a new century that would witness changes more dramatic than any the world had yet seen, Victoria entered the final months of her life with the quiet dignity of someone who had fulfilled her deepest obligations and was ready to rest. At 81 years old, she had reigned for more than 63 years, longer than any British monarch before her, and had become the living symbol of an age that was passing into history. The new century brought immediate challenges that tested Victoria's resilience one final time. The Boer War continued to drain British resources and international goodwill, while her beloved grandson Wilhelm's increasingly aggressive policies in Germany cast shadows over the European peace she had worked so hard to maintain. Yet, Victoria faced these trials with the same steady determination that had characterized her entire reign, understanding that her role now was to provide stability and continuity, while others dealt with the practical details of governing an empire in transition. Christmas 1900 at Osborne House was celebrated with the quiet intimacy that had characterized Victoria's family gatherings since Albert's death nearly 40 years earlier. The house that Albert had designed as their private retreat from the formalities of court life now served as a peaceful sanctuary where Victoria could spend what she somehow sensed might be her final Christmas with the children and grandchildren who had brought such meaning to her later years. The familiar rituals of the holiday season took on special poignancy as Victoria moved slowly through rooms filled with decorations that recalled decades of family celebrations. The Christmas tree, adorned with candles and small gifts in the German tradition Albert had introduced to Britain, cast its gentle light on faces that now included great-grandchildren, whose births had brought unexpected joy to Victoria's advanced years. These youngest members of the family would grow up with only dim memories of their great-grandmother, yet they would carry forward the values and traditions she and Albert had worked so carefully to instill. Victoria's physical decline had accelerated noticeably during the autumn of 1900, though she continued to fulfill her essential duties as sovereign with the determination that had sustained her through 6 decades of service. Her handwriting, once so firm and decisive, now trembled with the effort of maintaining her extensive correspondence. Her steps, never quick but always purposeful, had become uncertain and required the support of attendants who moved with the careful attention of those who understood they were witnessing the end of an era. Yet her mind remained clear and engaged with the great questions that would shape the new century. She continued to read government dispatches, though now they were often read aloud by her private secretary, due to the strain that detailed documents placed on her failing eyesight. Her comments on policy matters retained the sharpness of analysis that had made her consultations valuable to ministers throughout her reign, even as her voice grew weaker and her stamina more limited. The approach of the new century had prompted widespread reflection on the achievements and significance of the Victorian age, and Victoria herself had become increasingly conscious of her role as both witness to and symbol of unprecedented historical change. In her private moments, she would sometimes sit quietly in her study at Osborne, surrounded by portraits of Albert and mementos of their shared life, contemplating the long journey that had brought her from that frightened 18-year-old girl awakened at Kensington Palace to this position as the revered matriarch of a global empire. Her journal entries from these final months reveal a woman at peace with the approaching end of her earthly responsibilities. She wrote with growing frequency about her anticipation of reunion with Albert, her certainty that death would bring not obliteration but transformation, her gratitude for the privilege of serving her people through so many decades of change and challenge. There was no fear in these reflections, only a quiet readiness to lay down burdens that had been carried faithfully for so long. The winter of 1901 settled over Osborne House with unusual severity, confining Victoria increasingly to her private apartments, where fires burned constantly against the January cold. Her appetite, never robust in her later years, diminished further, though she continued to take tea each afternoon according to the routine that had structured her days for decades. These tea times became precious opportunities for quiet conversation with her children and closest attendants, moments when the formal requirements of monarchy could be set aside in favor of the simpler intimacies of family life. Dr. James Reed, Victoria's physician, watched the Queen's declining strength with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was caring for more than just an elderly patient. The death of Victoria would mark the end of an era in British history, the conclusion of a reign that had lasted longer than most people's entire lifetimes, and had overseen the transformation of Britain into the world's dominant power. Its responsibility of guiding the royal family through the transition that was approaching weighed heavily on everyone who served in the household during these final weeks. Victoria's last public appearance occurred on December 18, 1900, when she distributed Christmas gifts to her household staff according to the customs she had maintained for decades. Moving slowly but with dignity, supported by her walking stick and the steady hand of her Indian attendant, she personally thanked each servant for their faithful service, her words carrying special weight because everyone present understood the significance of the moment. The simple ceremony, conducted without fanfare in one of Osborne's reception rooms, became an unexpected farewell to a lifetime of dedication to duty and service. As January 1901 progressed, Victoria's condition gradually worsened, though she remained alert and involved in family affairs whenever her strength permitted. Her children, summoned from their various European residences, gathered at Osborne House to maintain the vigil that royal protocol and filial devotion both demanded. The Prince of Wales, soon to become King Edward VII, took on an increasing responsibility for essential government business, though Victoria retained her authority and continued to be consulted on important matters until nearly the end. The approach of death brought a remarkable serenity to Victoria's manner that impressed everyone who witnessed her final days. The woman who had once been so passionate in her grief over Albert's death now faced her own departure with quiet acceptance, as if she had finally learned the lesson that life and death were simply different phases of an existence that transcended earthly boundaries. She spoke often of Albert during these final weeks, sometimes addressing him as if he were present in the room, anticipating their reunion with the joy of someone who had been separated too long from her dearest companion. On January 19th, Victoria suffered a minor stroke that left her weakened but still conscious and able to recognize the family members who surrounded her bed. The Duchess of Argyll, her daughter Louise, held one hand while the Prince of Wales held the other, their presence providing the human connection that had always been the foundation of Victoria's understanding of her role. Dr. Reed monitored her condition carefully, but everyone present understood that medical intervention could do little more than ensure her comfort during the transition that was approaching. The final day, January 22nd, 1901, dawned clear and cold over the Solent, with winter sunshine streaming through the windows of Victoria's bedroom to illuminate a scene of remarkable peace and dignity. The Queen lay quietly, her breathing shallow but regular, surrounded by her children and closest grandchildren, who had gathered to witness the end of the longest and most influential reign in British history. The room was filled not with the drama of crisis, but with the gentle sadness of a natural conclusion to a life fully lived. As evening approached, Victoria's breathing became more labored, and Dr. Reed quietly informed the family that the end was near. The Prince of Wales, who had waited 60 years to inherit the throne, took his mother's hand and spoke words of love and gratitude, while his siblings and their children formed a circle around the bed that had become an altar of farewell. The Kaiser, Victoria's grandson Wilhelm, had arrived just in time to join this final vigil, setting aside for the moment the political tensions that had strained their relationship. At 6:30 on the evening of January 22nd, 1901, as the last light of day faded over the waters that separated the Isle of Wight from the mainland, Victoria drew her final breath. There was no struggle, no dramatic final words, simply the gentle conclusion of a life that had been dedicated to service from its earliest conscious moments. The reign that had begun with an 18-year-old girl's frightened acceptance of an unexpected crown ended with an elderly woman's peaceful surrender to the ultimate authority that claims all earthly rulers. The silence that followed Victoria's death seemed to extend far beyond the walls of Osborne's house, as if the entire empire had paused to acknowledge the passing of the sovereign who had given her name to an age. In London, the flags were lowered to half-staff as news of the Queen's death spread through the capital and across the networks of telegraph and railway that had been built during her reign. Throughout the empire, from India to Canada to Australia, similar scenes of mourning marked the end of an era that many had assumed would continue indefinitely. Victoria's funeral, held on February 2nd, 1901. St. George's Chapel, Windsor, provided a fitting conclusion to a reign that had been characterized by dignity, duty, and devotion to the welfare of her people. The ceremony was attended by representatives of every royal house in Europe, gathering that demonstrated the extent to which Victoria had become the matriarch, not just of her own family, but of European monarchy itself. The sight of kings and emperors walking behind the small coffin draped in white and gold reminded observers that greatness is not measured in physical stature, but in the breadth of influence and the depth of service. As Victoria's coffin was lowered into the vault beside Albert's at Frogmore, the finality of the moment was softened by the understanding that her influence would continue through the institutions she had strengthened, the traditions she had established, and the example she had set of how power could be exercised with wisdom, compassion, and unwavering dedication to duty. The Victorian age had ended, but the values it represented progress guided by moral purpose, strength tempered with mercy, authority exercised in service rather than for personal gain, who would continue to influence the world she had left behind. The empire that Victoria had inherited as a collection of territories held together, primarily by force, had been transformed during her reign into a community of nations, bound by increasingly voluntary ties of loyalty and mutual interest. The constitutional monarchy she had inherited from her predecessors had evolved into a system that balanced royal authority with democratic accountability, providing stability while allowing for peaceful change. The Britain she had known as a young queen, still primarily agricultural and limited in its international influence, had become the world's first industrial superpower, its technologies and institutions copied throughout the world. Yet, perhaps, Victoria's greatest legacy lay not in these grand historical achievements, but in the more personal example she had provided of how a life could be lived with purpose, dignity, and unwavering commitment to principles larger than individual ambition. She had shown that power could be a form of service, that authority could coexist with humility, and that the highest forms of leadership involve not commanding others, but inspiring them to discover their own capacity for greatness. As the mourners departed from Windsor and the normal rhythms of life resumed throughout the empire, Victoria's subjects faced the future with uncertainty about what the new century would bring, but with confidence that the foundations she had helped establish were strong enough to support whatever challenges lay ahead. The Queen was dead, but the ideals she had embodied: duty, service, progress guided by moral purpose, would continue to inspire future generations long after her name had been inscribed among the great rulers of history. And now, dear listener, as our gentle journey through Victoria's long life draws to its peaceful close, let yourself drift toward the same quiet rest that came to our Queen after 63 years of faithful service. Like the evening light that faded over the Solent on that January day in 1901. Let your own days, cares, and concerns fade into the warm darkness of sleep. Victoria's story is ended, but the peace she found at the last, the deep rest that comes to those who have lived with purpose, and loved with dedication. This same peace is yours to claim as you close your eyes and allow the gentle currents of sleep to carry you toward your own sweet dreams. Rest now in the knowledge that duty faithfully performed, love generously given, and service humbly offered are the truest foundations for a life well lived. Sleep peacefully as Victoria sleeps in the eternal quiet where all earthly crowns are laid aside and only love remains. Good night.